Welcome to Harry's Verse. Today's adventure, what if Harry Potter claimed all 3 deathly hallows and became the true master of death? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Tale of the 3 Brothers. Number 12. Grimmauld Place kept its silences the way old houses keep damp. Soaked into the walls, pooled in the floorboards, settled into the particular cold of rooms nobody used anymore. Harry had learned its geography of quiet by the second week of August. The drawing room, where dust motes hung in a single shaft of window light like something embalmed. The kitchen, where Molly Weasley's determined clattering couldn't quite fill the space Sirius had left in it. The narrow stairs that still, absurdly, expected footsteps that weren't coming. Downstairs, the order came and went at odd hours. Boots on the hall runner, low voices behind closed doors that stopped the moment his own footsteps sounded on the stairs. Moody's magical eye tracked him through walls he still hadn't learned to avoid. Tonks knocked over the umbrella stand twice a week with the same cheerful apology and twice a week Mrs. Berweek. Black's portrait woke and screamed about blood traitors and filth until somebody wrestled the curtains shut, and the house swallowed the noise the way it swallowed everything into damp and dust and the particular hush of a building that had outlived several generations of people who'd hated living in it. Harry had gotten very good that summer at being present in a house without being seen in it. He sat through Molly's dinners and answered when spoken to, ate what was put in front of him, said he was fine when asked, which was often, and true, which it mostly wasn't. He let Lupin sit with him some evenings, the two of them not talking, which was its own kind of conversation, the only kind Harry had patience for that summer. He wrote back to Ron and Hermione often enough that neither of them could accuse him of vanishing, and vanished anyway, in every way that mattered. And most nights, once the house had gone properly quiet and the last of the order had disappeared or trudged upstairs to the spare rooms, he climbed to Sirius's old room and sat there among what was left, because it was the one place in the building that didn't ask anything of him. Not comfort, not conversation, not even grief performed correctly, on schedule, for an audience that meant well and exhausted him anyway. There wasn't much left to sort. A trunk of old Gryffindor robes, moth-holed at the shoulders. A drawer of motorcycle parts that still smelled of engine oil. A shoebox of photographs he hadn't managed to look at twice. And the book. He found it at the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in a square of oilcloth gone stiff with age, and almost mistook it for another photograph album before the spine cracked under his thumb and he saw the title stamped in tarnished gilt, The Tales of Beedle the Bard, a child's book, worn soft at the corners from generations of careless handling. He recognized 2 of the 5 stories, vaguely, from things Hermione had once mentioned in the offhand way she mentioned anything she assumed the whole world already knew. He couldn't think why Sirius would have kept it. Then he opened the cover and found, in a spidery hand 3 generations removed from Sirius's own scrawl, a name. Property of I. Black, née Peverell, 1791. He didn't think much of it that first night. Old families collected old things. The Blacks collected everything, obsessively, the way people collect proof that they matter. But his eye kept snagging on the name through the numb weeks that followed, and he found himself going back to the book because it gave him somewhere to put his attention that wasn't the still, arch-shaped doorway that had swallowed Sirius, wasn't the sound the room had made in the seconds after, wasn't the particular silence of Lupin's face when he'd hauled Harry back from the edge of it. He read The Tale of the 3 Brothers for the first time on a Tuesday, and didn't understand why it stopped his hand on the page. He read it again on Wednesday. By Friday, he had it by heart, memorized before he'd cared at all about what the words meant, absorbed the same unthinking way he'd once picked up the offside rule of Quidditch. Automatically. Uselessly. And then, all at once, not uselessly. 3 brothers cross a river by magic. Death, cheated of its due, offers each of them a gift instead of a grudge. The eldest asks for a wand that cannot lose, and it kills him for his pride within the year. The second asks for a stone to call back the dead, and it drives him to the noose within the same year, unable to bear a love that had come back wrong. The third asks only for a means to go on his way unseen, and lives a long life, and greets death at the end of it. Not as a slave and not as a conqueror, but as an old acquaintance, and goes with him gladly, as equals. He'd always assumed it was a story about accepting death gracefully. Now, at 16 going on something older, sitting in a dead man's room while a dead man's mother screamed faintly downstairs at nothing, he thought it might be a story about something else. Not acceptance. Terms. He didn't tell anyone he was reading it. He didn't tell anyone much of anything that August. Hermione's letters arrived twice a week, dense with concern disguised as information. She'd found 3 references to Horcruxes and Magic Most Vile. Did he want her to copy them out? Was he eating? Was he sleeping? Was he talking to anyone? Ron's arrived less often and more awkwardly, full of Quidditch scores and the studious avoidance of anything that mattered. Harry answered both with the same careful blankness he'd perfected over a summer of pretending to be fine. For people who needed him to be fine so they could stop worrying and get on with their own grief. Only Ginny had caught him at it. Midnight, the kitchen, tea neither of them wanted, the rest of the house sleep. She'd looked at him over the rim of her cup and said, "You've gone somewhere. I can see it. You're not here half the time you're here." He hadn't denied it. He hadn't been able to explain it either. Not the reading, not the name in the front of the book, not the cold, curious thing uncoiling in his chest that felt less like grief and more like a question finally being asked in the right order. "I'm okay," he'd said, which was the lie everyone wanted, and she'd let it go because she was 15 and grieving her own losses and didn't have the energy to fight him for the truth. He'd hated himself a little for that. Not enough to stop. Dumbledore summoned him back to the lessons in the first week of September. Once term had begun, and Harry had returned to Hogwarts with the rest of them, sorted back into the castle's rhythms as though the summer had simply been a country he'd visited and come home from. The office was the same as ever. Silver instruments whirred and puffed on their spindle-legged tables. Fawkes preened on his perch by the window, molting season past, new feathers coming in a deep and living gold. Dumbledore poured memories into the pensive with the same unhurried theater, a man with more time than anyone else in the room. They were 3 lessons in through Riddle's grandfather, the Gaunts, the ring that had been Marvolo's and then Morphin's and then, disastrously, Tom's, before Harry understood he was being told a story with the ending filed off. It wasn't a conscious deduction at first, it was a texture. Dumbledore's voice when he spoke about Voldemort's soul had a particular carefulness to it that Harry had learned to recognize over 5 years of being lied to gently by people who loved him. Mrs. Weasley steering conversations away from the war. Lupin choosing his words about Sirius with the same delicate tongues. Dumbledore was doing it now, not lying exactly. Selecting. Horcruxes, Dumbledore said on the 3rd lesson, turning the word over like a stone he was checking for a crack, are, put simply, objects in which a dark wizard has hidden part of his soul. How do you hide part of your soul? By committing an act of unparalleled evil. Murder, in its purest and most irrevocable form, the supreme act of violation because it rends the soul, which is not naturally designed to be split. The dark wizard then seizes upon the damage and encases the torn portion. How many pieces did he split his into? A pause, long enough that Harry, watching Dumbledore's face over the rim of his own patience, saw something pass behind the half-moon spectacles that hadn't been there in the previous 2 lessons. A weighing. A private arithmetic. That, Harry, I have not yet determined with certainty. My estimation, informed by considerable research and by a conversation I will show you presently, is 7. 7 pieces of soul. 6. If we speak of Horcruxes specifically, the 7th, however maimed, would remain within Voldemort himself. Harry did the sum without meaning to. 6 hidden. The diary. Destroyed already. The ring, which Dumbledore's blackened, dying hand had told half the story of before he'd even opened his mouth to explain it. That left 4, somewhere in the world, cradling scraps of the thing that had killed his parents. And Dumbledore meant to send him after them one by one, like a dog sent after grouse, and never once, not in 3 lessons, not in the careful unspooling of Riddle's childhood cruelties, not in the studied warmth of my dear boy, had he said the other thing, the thing Harry was beginning, in the small hours, in Sirius's cold room with the book open on his knees, to suspect. He didn't ask that night. He wasn't ready to hear it confirmed, and some old, patient part of him, the part that had survived a decade with the Dursleys by knowing exactly when to go quiet and watch, understood that Dumbledore would not simply hand him the truth. It would have to be taken. Snape gave it to him instead, 3 weeks later, and not out of kindness. It happened after a detention that had nothing to do with occlumency, and everything to do with Harry's potions essay, which Snape had returned with more red ink than parchment and the word inadequate, underlined twice. Harry stayed behind to rewrite it, at Snape's insistence, a petty cruelty dressed as pedagogy, and the dungeon classroom had gone dark and cold around the single candle Snape allowed him. Somewhere in the 2nd hour of silence, broken only by scratching quills, Snape said, without looking up from his own marking, "You are not sleeping." It wasn't a question. Harry didn't answer it as one. "Lessons with the headmaster keeping you occupied, I imagine." Snape went on in the flat, unhurried voice he used for the worst things he said. No cruelty in the tone at all, which was somehow worse than when there was. "Memories of the Dark Lord's youth. Fascinating history. I trust he is being thorough. He's teaching me what I need to know." "Is he?" Snape set down his quill and looked at Harry properly. Black eyes doing the thing they did that always felt like being weighed on a scale calibrated to find you wanting. "Tell me, Potter. In these thorough lessons, has the headmaster mentioned the ring?" "Yes." "And the diary?" "Yes." "And the diary?" "Has he mentioned," Snape said, and here his voice changed very slightly into something colder and more exact, a scalpel finding the place to cut, "what became of the scar on your forehead the night your mother died to protect you? Has he offered any theory as to why the wound never fully healed? Why you dream in Parseltongue you were never taught? Why you have felt, on occasion, sensations that were not your own?" The candle guttered. Harry didn't move. "No," Snape said, answering himself, watching Harry's face with an attention that felt almost scientific. "Cataloging. I thought not. He is very good at teaching lessons in the order that suits him." A pause, and then, quietly, in a voice that might almost have been reluctant if Snape had been capable of reluctance. "There is a theory, Potter. I do not say it is confirmed, because Dumbledore has never confirmed it to me either in so many words. He is careful about what he confirms, even to those of us who have bled for him. But I have seen enough of the Dark Lord's mind, over enough years, to have formed my own opinion. The night he tried to kill you and failed, something went wrong on his end as well as yours. A piece of him did not go where the rest went. Where did it go? Harry said. His voice came out steadier than he expected, and some part of him noted that steadiness the way you'd note a scar you hadn't known you had, proof of something already believed, before it had a shape. Snape didn't answer directly. He never did, when directness would cost him something. You asked me once, in a fit of self-pity I recall vividly, why the headmaster trusts me. I've never told you the true answer because it was not mine to give. I will tell you a piece of it now because I find I am tired, Potter, of watching a boy walk toward a cliff edge with a blindfold that better men than I tied on him for reasons he called the greater good. Snape's mouth twisted around the phrase like it tasted of something spoiled. The Dark Lord will not be destroyed while a piece of his soul survives outside his body, tethered to this world. You are, by every measure I am competent to make, tethered to this world in a manner that predates your Hogwarts letter. Draw your own conclusions. I am done drawing them for you. He picked his quill back up. The scratching resumed, as if nothing had happened. A cold desk in a dungeon settling back into ordinary silence around the place. A 16-year-old had just learned the shape of his own death. Harry sat very still for a long time, not shaking. That would come later, alone, and even then it would be a small, contained thing. Not the operatic collapse he might once have staged for himself. Right now, there was only a kind of falling into place, puzzle pieces he'd half assembled without letting himself see the picture, snapping suddenly and silently into a whole. Horcrux. The word Dumbledore had spent 3 lessons defining with such patient, bloodless precision. An object in which a dark wizard has hidden part of his soul. Not always an object. Snape hadn't said the word object. He thought of the diary, 16 and cocky and murderous, speaking to Ginny in her own hand out of a page. He thought of the ring on Dumbledore's blackened hand. He thought of Dumbledore's careful arithmetic. My estimation is 7, and the way the old man's eyes hadn't quite met his when he said it, a fraction of a second too long spent studying the middle distance. The practiced evasion of a man who has told 1,000 comforting half-truths and has grown expert at knowing which ones will hold weight and which will crumble under a direct question. He was the 7th piece. Or the accident that had become one. It hardly mattered which, for what it meant going forward. Sir, he said, and his voice had no tremor in it at all, which frightened him more than the discovery had. Am I going to have to die? Snape's quill stopped. He didn't look up immediately. When he did, there was nothing in his face Harry could name. Not pity, not satisfaction, not the cold contempt Harry had spent 5 years learning to read past, just exhausted honesty. The look of a man who has decided on balance that a cruelty delivered plainly is kinder than a comfort delivered as camouflage. I do not know, Snape said. I know what would be required if the Dark Lord is to be ended for good rather than merely inconvenienced again. I know the headmaster has considered it. I know he has not told you, and I know why he has not told you. And I find, this evening, that I do not think his reasons are good enough to justify the manner of the telling or the not telling. He set the quill down a second time. Final. Go to bed, Potter. Ask him yourself, if you have the stomach for the answer. I find I have run out of stomach for delivering it in his stead. He asked Dumbledore 2 days later, in the office, with Fawkes silent on his perch, and the pensive silver light throwing long shadows up the curved walls. He hadn't planned the confrontation, or rather he'd planned it a dozen different ways over 2 sleepless nights, and abandoned every version because every version assumed Dumbledore would try to talk him out of the question before he'd finished asking it. In the end, he simply said it, flatly, in the middle of a lesson about Horace Slughorn and a memory Dumbledore suspected had been tampered with. Am I a Horcrux? The silence that followed had weight to it. Harry watched Dumbledore's face do something he had genuinely never seen it do before. Not the twinkle dimming. He'd seen that plenty, in the aftermath of the prophecy, in the ruins of the Ministry after Sirius. This was different. This was a very old, very controlled man being caught cleanly, without room to maneuver, and knowing it. Where'd you learn that word? Dumbledore said, which was not a denial, and they both knew it. Does it matter? It matters to me, who has been carrying this burden of knowledge instead of bringing it to me directly. Is that a yes? Dumbledore set down the crystal phial he'd been holding, Slughorn's tampered memory, waiting to be examined, with the exaggerated gentleness of a man buying himself 3 seconds of thought. When he looked up, the twinkle was entirely gone, and what remained was older than Harry had ever let himself see it. I believe, Dumbledore said, that on the night Voldemort attempted to kill you, and his curse rebounded upon himself through your mother's sacrifice, his soul, already unstable from repeated splitting, tore further in a manner he neither intended nor controlled. A fragment, seeking refuge in the only living thing nearby, attached itself to you. Yes, I believe you are, unwillingly and unknowingly until this moment, a Horcrux, though not one he built on purpose. My estimate of 7 pieces accounted for 6 deliberate Horcruxes and the portion that remained within him. You are an 8th, an accident born of his own instability rather than his design. And I did not include you in the count I gave you 3 weeks ago because I had not yet found the courage to say the word aloud in your presence. There it was. said plainly, at last in a voice with no music left in it. "And you knew. I have suspected for some years. I have been certain for rather less time than that." "How long?" "Certain? Since the end of your 4th year, when I watched Voldemort's return and considered its mechanics at length. Suspected since your 2nd year, perhaps. When you spoke parcel-tongue to a chamber, only Slytherin's own blood should have opened, and I did not yet have the courage to finish the thought. And you didn't tell me?" "No. No qualification. No, I was going to when the time was right, which was the lie Harry had braced for, the lie that would have let him stay angry in a clean, simple way. Dumbledore simply said no, and let it sit there. And Harry understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water down the back of his collar, that the old man was not going to defend himself. That he considered the decision on some level indefensible, and had chosen to let it be indefensible rather than dress it in comfort. Why? Because I did not know how to tell a boy of 12, or 14, or even 15, that a piece of the man who murdered his parents was lodged behind his own eyes, without also telling him what must eventually be done about it. I did not believe you were ready to carry that weight before you had to. I have watched you carry a great deal, Harry, more than any child should be asked to carry, and I made a judgment, again and again, term after term, that you had enough to bear already. I did not ask you to agree the judgment was correct. I am no longer entirely certain myself. What must eventually be done about it?" Harry heard his own voice from a distance, level, almost polite, the way you might ask someone to pass the salt. "Say it. You've said everything else. Say that part." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, really looked, trying to see past Harry's face into whatever was assembling itself behind it. "The piece of Voldemort's soul that resides in you cannot be extracted by any means I am aware of, without destroying the vessel that carries it. I do not know this with the certainty of a mathematical proof. I know it with the certainty of an old man who has studied dark magic for 60 years and can find no comforting alternative in any text, however obscure. If Voldemort is to be well and truly ended, if this war is to have a final chapter rather than a 4th resurrection and a 5th, then at some point, near the close of it, you may be required to let him kill you. And the hope, the theory for it, is no more than that, is that the fragment dies, and you, having already conquered death once through your mother's love, do not." The hope. Harry turned the word over. Not a promise. Not even a plan, really. A wager on a technicality, dressed up in 60 years of careful language. He was the stake. You built a war around a maybe. I built a war around the only maybe I could find, against an enemy who has none of my scruples about certainty. You could have told me, years ago, let me decide what to do with that instead of. He stopped, recalibrated. He was not going to raise his voice in this office. He'd decided that much on the walk up the spiral stair before he even knew what shape the conversation would take, because raising his voice was what the old Harry would have done, the one who'd broken Dumbledore's instruments in a grief-blind fury after Sirius fell, and gotten exactly nothing for the effort except a headmaster's patient forgiveness, which had felt, in retrospect, like being patted on the head, instead of deciding for me. Again. "Yes," Dumbledore said. "I decided for you. I have been deciding for you since you were 18 months old, and I left you on a doorstep in November because I judged it the safest course, and I did not ask your opinion then either because you did not have one to give, and I confess I never entirely broke the habit of thinking of you as that child, even as you became something considerably more formidable. That is not an excuse. It is, I think, the truth, and you have earned the truth this evening if nothing else." It should have felt like a victory, hearing that. It didn't. It felt like watching a very old bridge finally give way under weight it had been groaning under for years. No triumph in it. Just the slow, inevitable arithmetic of strain finally exceeding tolerance. "I want you to know I'm not angry." He watched Dumbledore absorb that and understood, from the faint recalibration in the old man's face, that it hadn't landed as reassurance. It wasn't meant to. Harry wasn't angry. Anger was hot, and this was not hot. This was something that had gone past heat into a clean, load-bearing cold. The temperature at which decisions got made and stayed made. He didn't say any of that aloud. He simply stood and thanked the headmaster with perfect and devastating courtesy for his time, and left the office before Dumbledore could find a way to fill the silence that followed him out the door. The gargoyle stepped aside without needing the password, which meant Dumbledore had left it keyed open, one last small courtesy extended after all the larger ones had failed. Harry walked down the spiral stair at an ordinary pace, past the empty portraits of headmasters who'd have opinions if they were awake to voice them, and out into a corridor gone silver with early autumn moonlight through the tall windows. He didn't hurry. He noticed almost as an afterthought that his hands weren't shaking, that his breathing hadn't changed, that some careful accountant behind his ribs had already totaled the evening's cost without presenting him the bill. Portraits watched him pass and said nothing for once, which he was grateful for. He passed the third-floor corridor, where a three-headed dog had once nearly ended him at 11, and the memory arrived with no weight attached to it at all. A story that had happened to someone he used to be. He didn't go back to Gryffindor Tower. He went to the 7th floor corridor instead, to the blank stretch of wall opposite Barnabas the barman, and paced it 3 times with a single thought held steady in his mind. Somewhere, to think, somewhere no one will find me, until the door appeared and led him into a circular, book-lined chamber, with a fire already lit and a single deep chair angled toward it, the castle itself having decided, apparently, that he needed exactly this and nothing more. He sat. He did not cry, which surprised him, distantly, the way an absence of pain sometimes surprises a body that expected it. He took the copy of Beetle the Bard out of his bag. He'd taken to carrying it everywhere lately, the way some people carried a locket, and opened it to the 3rd tale and read it again by firelight. Slowly this time, reading for what was underneath the words rather than the words themselves. The elder brother, being a combative man, asked for a wand more powerful than any in existence. Pride, a weapon to end all arguments, and it had ended him instead, in his sleep, throat cut for the wand itself. The second brother, being an arrogant man, decided that he wanted to humiliate death still further and asked for the power to recall others from death. Grief, weaponized into denial. A love brought back wrong. A bride cold and sad and not truly of this world, until he couldn't bear the distance between the memory and the thing and hanged himself to close it. The third and youngest brother was the humblest and also the wisest of the brothers and did not trust death. Not humble because he lacked ambition. Humble because he understood, correctly, that death's gifts weren't gifts at all but traps shaped like gifts, offered to men. Death expected to destroy themselves with, out of exactly the flaws death had already measured in each brother's character. The youngest asked for something that looked like the smallest request, and was, in fact, the only one that couldn't be turned against him. Passage, not power. Concealment, not conquest. And lived, the story said. Lived a long, full life, and only at the very end, when he was old, laid the cloak aside and greeted death as an old friend and went with him gladly, and, as equals, they departed this life. Harry sat with the fire going low and turned the shape of the thing over and over, the way you turn a key in your hand before you understood which lock it opened. Everyone read the tale as a story about wisdom lying in restraint. Don't reach for the wand, don't reach for the stone. Be content with a plain gray cloak and a quiet life. He'd read it that way himself, the first 4 times. But Snape's flat voice and Dumbledore's the hope, the theory, for it is no more than that, had rearranged the furniture of his understanding, and he read it differently now. The third brother hadn't refused power. He'd refused the wrong shape of it. The shapes designed by death to be weaknesses in disguise, offered specifically to men whose flaws death had already catalogued. He had claimed the one gift that let him live entirely on his own terms, untouchable by death's usual traps, for as long as he chose, and at the very end when he chose to stop choosing, death had not taken him. He had gone. Verb, not object. Subject, not casualty. Master of death. That was what the old story called him. In the line everyone skimmed past on the way to the moral. Not death's plaything. Not death's victim, twice over, like his brothers. Its master, and the story made a quiet point of specifying that the mastery hadn't come from any single Hallow. It had come from holding all 3. From a man wise enough to want the wand's power and the stone's promise and the cloak's concealment, and disciplined enough not to be ruled by wanting any one of them the way his brothers had been ruled. Harry thought about Dumbledore's careful, decades-long architecture of a plan that hinged on the hope he would die correctly and stay dead incorrectly. He thought about a war being built, brick by patient brick, around his eventual sacrifice without his consent, by men who loved him and had decided love gave them the right to spend him. He thought, no, not defiance exactly, or not only that, something colder and more considered. If death was coming for him regardless, if Voldemort wanted him dead and Dumbledore's own plan required him to die on schedule at the correct dramatic moment for the story to resolve the way the old man's 60 years of careful calculation demanded, then Harry was not going to arrive at that reckoning as anyone's instrument. Not Voldemort's accidental anchor, not Dumbledore's necessary sacrifice, not even, in the end, death's ordinary customer standing in the queue with everyone else who'd never bothered to ask what terms might be negotiable. He was going to do what the third brother had done, deliberately, awake, eyes open the whole way through instead of stumbling into it by prophecy and accident, the way everyone from Trelawney to Dumbledore to Voldemort himself seemed to assume he would. He already had one Hallow. He'd had it for 5 years and never once thought of it as anything but a useful, sentimental object. His father's cloak, silver gray and famously perfect, that never dimmed and never tore and had kept him hidden through half a dozen catastrophes he probably shouldn't have survived. He took it out of his bag now and spread it over his knees, running his thumb along a seam so fine it was nearly invisible. He thought of Ollivander's odd, lingering attention to his wand 2 years before, during the Triwizard wand weighing, curious, and of a name he'd heard once, in passing, in a lesson about wand lore he'd barely paid attention to, Gregorovitch, and a wand that changed hands not by inheritance but by conquest. He thought of a ring on a dying man's blackened hand, and understood, with the settling, irreversible calm of a decision finally made, that he already knew exactly where each of the other 2 Hallows currently was, or near enough to start. He said it once, aloud, alone, in the empty round room, testing the shape of it in his own mouth, the way you test a key that might or might not turn. Master of Death. It turned. The library after curfew belonged to nobody, which suited him. He'd learned the trick of it years ago, from Hermione originally, though she would have been appalled at the use he now put it to. A disillusionment charm, imperfectly matched to Shadow, a patient hour spent between the restricted section's black iron gate and the genealogy shelves nobody but the occasional obsessive pureblood ever visited, and Madame Pince none the wiser, her candle bobbing past tonight on a schedule. Harry had clocked within 3 sittings. He started with the Peverills because they were the thread he already had a hand on. Nature's Nobility, a wizarding genealogy gave him 2 brittle pages and a family tree with more gaps than branches. Ignotus, Cadmus, Antioch. 3 names out of the deep past, and then centuries of thinning ink where the direct line married out, and out again, into families that no longer used the name. The Gaunts on one crooked branch, the Blacks on another, more respectable one, until the surname Peveril existed nowhere except in footnotes, and the flyleaf of a dead man's book. He copied out every marriage, every recorded death, in a hand that got steadier the longer he worked, because this, unlike grief, was a problem with an actual shape. Edges he could find with his fingers in the dark. Wand lore took longer and taught him less than he wanted and more than he expected. And compendium of wand woods and cores, 3 centuries out of date and smelling of pipe smoke, mentioned in a single dry footnote that certain wands are documented to have changed allegiance not through purchase or inheritance, but through defeat of the previous owner in combat, a phenomenon most wand makers regard as folklore, though Gregorovich of Nuremberg-the-Vards has on several occasions publicly disputed the dismissal. He sat with that footnote a long while. Gregorovitz has on Sentlil Center, the name Ollivander had once used, unprompted, 2 years and a lifetime ago, examining Harry's own wand at the Triwizard, weighing with an expression Harry had been too young and too rattled to properly read. Curious. He hadn't understood the word at 14. He thought he was beginning to now. He did not go looking for information about Dumbledore's wand directly. That would have left a trail, and he had decided that first week back, watching the old man across a great hall at breakfast with a courtesy he no longer entirely felt, that trails were something he intended to stop leaving. Instead, he asked Professor Flitwick, in a charms lesson on wand work theory, an idle-sounding question about how long the Elder Wand of Legend was supposed to have existed, and got, in return, an unprompted and delighted 10-minute lecture on the 3 brothers as folkloric wand lore rather than moral fable, complete with a throwaway mention that the wand's documented history, so far as anyone credible had traced it, ran through a duelist named Gregorovich, and before that, a wandmaker whose workshop had burned in mysterious circumstances the professor did not care to feared. Harry wrote none of it down where anyone could find it. He didn't need to. He had begun, somewhere in the last fortnight, to keep the important things only in the one place nobody else could search. Behind an occlumency shield he was, for the first time, glad Snape had ever bothered to teach him to build. He didn't tell Ron and Hermione that week, or the week after. It wasn't secrecy for its own sake. Or it wasn't only that. It was the recognition, quiet and unwelcome, that he needed to know his own mind on this before he let anyone else's love for him start shaping it. The way Dumbledore's love had shaped an entire war around a maybe without ever consulting him once. He wasn't going to do that to the people who trusted him. He would know exactly what he intended before he let them near it, so that when he told them, and he would, he promised himself that much standing at the dormitory window looking out over the Black Lake, it would be a plan they could choose to stand aside, not a secret they'd have to forgive him for keeping. They noticed the change anyway. Of course they did. They had spent 5 years learning him the way you learn weather, by the shape of the clouds before the rain arrives. 3 days after the confrontation in Dumbledore's office, Hermione cornered him in an empty stretch of the library between charms and dinner, arms folded, the particular set to her mouth that meant she had already decided the conversation and was only waiting for him to catch up to it. "You've stopped arguing with me," she said. "About anything. Do you know how strange that is? You used to argue with me about breakfast. I've had a lot on my mind. That's not an answer, it's a wall." She studied him for a moment with the same scrutiny she gave a difficult passage of arithmancy, hunting for the seam. "Ron thinks you're brooding about Sirius. I don't think that's all of it. You look like someone who's made a decision and is waiting to see if it holds." He almost told her, right there with the dust and the smell of old parchment and her clever, worried face in front of him. He wanted to, badly enough that it surprised him, but he thought of the shape of the thing still unfinished in his own head, half research and half resolve, and he thought that if he handed it to her now, in pieces, she would spend the next 6 months trying to talk him out of the parts that frightened her, which would be most of it. And he did not have 6 months of argument in him. He needed the plan whole before he could survive defending it. "When I know what I'm doing," he said, "you'll be the first person I tell. Both of you. I promise." "That's not a no. It's not a no." She studied him a moment longer and something in her face settled, not satisfied exactly, but willing to wait because 5 years had taught her that Harry Potter kept the promises that cost him something and broke the ones that didn't. "All right," she said. "But Harry, whatever it is, don't decide we can't help you carry it. That's Dumbledore's mistake, not yours to repeat." He didn't answer that because she'd landed closer to the bone than she knew, and he wasn't ready to let her see exactly how close. Ron caught him alone on the walk back from that same library, hands in his pockets, uncharacteristically without preamble. Hermione thinks you're plotting something. Hermione's usually right. Yeah, well. Ron considered his shoes for a moment. Whatever it is, if it's the kind of thing where you go off and do it alone because you reckon it's safer for everyone else, I want you to know that's rubbish. And I'll say so again whenever you need reminding, and I'm not going to stop just because you get that face on. He glanced up. The one you've got right now, actually. What face? The noble idiot face. Your dad apparently had one too, according to half the portraits in this castle. Runs in the family, I reckon. A beat, and then quieter, without the joke in it. I'm just saying, whatever's coming, save me a seat. Harry didn't promise anything that night. Not aloud, but he thought about it afterward, lying awake, and decided that was itself a kind of promise. The sort he intended to keep better than the ones made with words. He lay awake a long time that night. The dormitory dark and full of Ron's familiar snoring. The cloak folded on the trunk at the foot of his bed like something sleeping. He thought about libraries he would need to sit in, and a headmaster he would need to watch more carefully than he had ever watched anyone in his life. And, somewhere out past the castle's wards, moving through a war he no longer intended to fight on anyone's terms but his own. An old wand with a bloody, restless history, waiting the way old and powerful things wait, for someone patient enough and ruthless enough to come and take it properly. He fell asleep, for the first time in a month, without dreaming of the veil. Chapter 1. End. Chapter 2. Gregorovich's Ghost October at Hogwarts smelled of wood smoke and wet stone, and Harry spent most of it in the library, at a table he'd chosen for its sightlines rather than its light. Back to the wall. The restricted section's iron gate in clear view. The main doors visible past a row of card catalogs that gave him 3 seconds of warning before anyone reached him. He hadn't consciously decided to start thinking that way, in angles and warning times and who could see what from where. He noticed himself doing it one evening, halfway through a footnote on wand allegiance, and understood it wasn't paranoia. It was preparation, arriving ahead of the conscious decision to prepare, the way a body braces before the mind finishes naming the danger. The footnote in a compendium of wandwoods and cores had led him, over 3 weeks, to 4 other books, 2 of them technically off limits to 6 years, and acquired through the specific, patient bribery of a Ravenclaw prefect who owed Harry a favor from second year and had never quite worked out how to be repaid for. The picture that assembled itself, page by page, was not folklore anymore. It was a chain of custody. A wandmaker named Gregorovich, working out of a workshop near the town of Normgard in what was then still called Silesia, had for decades quietly cultivated a reputation for wands that performed beyond their materials. Wands whose owners won duels they had no right to win. He never explained the trick publicly. He didn't need to. Word traveled on its own, the way word travels about anyone who seems to have found a door nobody else can find. And sometime in the 1920s, a young, brilliant, and by every surviving account, deeply charming dark wizard calling himself Gellert Grindelwald had gone looking for that door, and according to 2 independent sources, Harry found buried in Old Prophet archives, and a smuggled continental history found buried in Old Prophet archives, and a smuggled continental history, her man walked it knocked in his. At its stop, Grindelwald had carried that wand through a war that had cost the wizarding world more than anyone still liked to discuss aloud. He had carried it until 1945, when a duel outside a small town whose name Harry had to look up twice because none of the books agreed on the spelling ended with Grindelwald defeated and disarmed by a much younger and considerably more famous wizard than Harry had ever thought to picture as young. Albus Dumbledore. He sat with that for a long time on the night he found it, the library gone dark and cold around him, a single lumos hovering over the page like a held breath. It made a terrible, elegant kind of sense, the sort of sense that arrives with its own weight already attached. Dumbledore had never talked about the duel. Not once, in 5 years, not in any lesson, not in any of the careful, controlled anecdotes he doled out about his own past like currency he didn't want to overspend. Harry had always assumed it was modesty. He understood now it might have been something closer to a man keeping a secret so large he'd built an entire persona of gentle unbotheredness around the shape of it, the way you'd build a house around a hole in the ground so nobody, including yourself, had to look at it directly. He started training the same week, on the theory that knowledge without capability was just a longer, better documented way of losing. He went to the room of requirement 3 nights out of 7, always late, always alone, and asked it for the same thing every time. A chamber built for one purpose, empty of anything that could be mistaken for company. He did not tell Ron and Hermione, not yet. He told himself that was tactical rather than cowardly, and mostly believed it. He started with nonverbal casting, because a duelist who had to speak his spells had already told his opponent what was coming. He'd managed nonverbal work in a classroom setting the year before, under Snape's contemptuous supervision, badly and inconsistently, the kind of skill that worked one time in 5 and embarrassed him the other 4. Alone, with no one to perform competence for, it came easier. He conjured targets, straw-stuffed and man-shaped, and knocked them down in silence until silence itself stopped feeling like an effort and started feeling like a second, quieter voice he could speak in whenever the first one would have given him away. Then he worked on the deflection. He'd read about it in a battered dueling manual from the library's least visited shelf. A chapter on angled protego work that most students skipped because it required nonverbal casting as a prerequisite, and most students, understandably, had given up on nonverbal casting by the time they reached that chapter. The theory was simple enough to say and brutal to execute. A standard shield charm stopped a curse. An angled one, cast a fraction early and rotated at the wrist, redirected it, turned an opponent's own momentum into a weapon aimed somewhere they hadn't chosen. He practiced it against the strawman, then against a charms conjure barrage that came faster and less predictably, then against himself, casting a curse one-handed and shielding it with the other in a discipline that left him bruised and shaking, and 3 weeks in, able to do it without thinking about it at all. He practiced the axial last and longest because it was the one spell in the sequence that had to be perfect or the whole plan collapsed into nothing. A targeted summoning charm on a moving object, aimed not at where the object was but at where it would be a half-second after a specific choreographed disruption, was not a spell taught at any level of Hogwarts curriculum Harry had access to. He built it himself. From theory scattered across 4 different texts and a great deal of trial conducted at 2 in the morning on wands he borrowed, unasked, from the school supply of confiscated contraband kept in Filch's office on the reasonable assumption that nobody would notice a handful of them going missing and reappearing a week later, faintly scorched. By the 3rd week, he could take a wand from a moving, resisting target 9 times out of 10, and he understood, with the flat, unglamorous clarity of someone who has actually done the arithmetic rather than simply hoped, that 9 times out of 10 against a straw man translated to something considerably worse against Albus Dumbledore, and that the whole plan therefore depended on making sure the engagement never came down to raw odds at all. It had to come down to the one moment he could engineer entirely on his own terms. Everything else was preparation for manufacturing that single moment and nothing more. He didn't go to the headmaster's office and demand an answer. That instinct, the one that had marched him up the spiral stair to ask, "Am I a Horcrux?" with no plan beyond the asking, had cooled into something more patient over 6 weeks of quiet research. He understood, now, that if he walked in and asked Dumbledore outright whether he held the most powerful wand ever made, he would get either a lie dressed as evasion or a truth dressed as a lecture on responsibility, and he had had enough of both from that particular source to last several lifetimes. What he needed wasn't confirmation. He already had that, in every way that mattered short of Dumbledore's own mouth admitting it. What he needed was leverage and timing, and a reason good enough that even Dumbledore, faced with it, would understand the refusal had stopped being an option somewhere in the last 5 years of the old man's own choices. Voldemort gave him that reason 3 days later, though he would never have chosen to receive it that way. Snape brought the report to an order meeting Harry wasn't meant to overhear, in the kitchen at Grimmauld Place over a Hogsmeade weekend, and Harry, standing on the stairs above the half-open door with a disillusionment charm he'd gotten considerably better at since September, heard enough of it to go very still. "He has sent inquiries into a wandmaker's death," Snape was saying, in the flat, reporting voice he used for information rather than opinion, which was somehow the more chilling register of the two. "A man named Gregorovitch. Continental, retired some decades ago, believed dead these past several years, though the Dark Lord's people have found no body and no grave, which has interested him considerably. He has also been asking, through channels I am not fully trusted with, about a duel in 1945 and about the current whereabouts of its outcome." A silence, and then Kingsley Shacklebolt's voice, careful. "You think he's chasing the wand?" "The old story." "I think," Snape said, "that the Dark Lord has recently become preoccupied, in a manner I have not observed in him before, with the subject of his own mortality. He does not use that word. He uses words like legacy and permanence, which are the same fear wearing better clothes. He has 5 safeguards remaining. Of these 6 he originally built, each of them an abomination I have personally helped him construct. And it is my professional opinion that a man who has gone to such lengths to avoid death does not stop being afraid of it simply because he has grown difficult to kill. If anything, the opposite. He has started asking after a wand that legend says cannot lose a duel, and I do not believe that is idle curiosity. And if he finds it?" Now was Lupin quieter. The question of a man doing arithmetic he didn't want to finish. Then he will possess, in addition to a soul in 7 unnatural pieces, a weapon no one now living has ever seen fail. I would prefer, for reasons I hope are obvious, that this not occur. Harry stood on the stairs a long time after the meeting broke up and the voices scattered toward the kitchen fire and the kettle, thinking about the shape of the thing now sitting fully assembled in front of him. Voldemort was hunting the Elder Wand. Voldemort did not know, could not know, that its current owner sat in a castle office eating lemon drops and worrying about his 16-year-old's grades. But Voldemort was patient and resourceful, and had 6 years and considerable resources to spend on the hunt. And sooner or later, if nobody moved first, he would find the trail Harry had found in a school library in 6 weeks, with nothing but a footnote and a grudge. Harry intended to move first. Some 140 miles east, in a manor house with its curtains kept permanently drawn against a village that had learned not to ask questions about the lights in its windows. Lord Voldemort was asking a different kind of question, of a man who had not slept in 3 days and was beginning to understand that sleep was no longer among the privileges available to him. "You are telling me," Voldemort said in the soft, unhurried voice his followers had learned to fear considerably more than his shouting, because his shouting meant he still cared whether you understood him, "that Gregorovitch has vanished. Not dead, not retired, vanished from a workshop under watch by 2 of my most capable trackers, without a single ward triggering, a single owl scent, a single soul in that town recalling having seen him leave. My lord, the workshop showed signs of a struggle predating our arrival by some years." Dust settled over broken glass. Whoever took him a long time ago and took considerable care doing it. Voldemort was quiet for a long moment, red eyes fixed on middle distance with the particular stillness of a mind running to possibilities faster than a human mind was built to. He had learned across 6 years of slow and careful rebuilding that the old stories were rarely only stories. He had built his own permanence out of one such story, the darkest chapter of a book most wizards were too frightened to finish reading, and it had not escaped his notice, in recent months, how often the word wandmaker and the word legend had begun turning up in the same old, half-credible sources, a wand that could not lose. He had dismissed it once, years ago, as the kind of comforting fiction weak wizards told themselves to explain away their own inadequate skill. He was no longer certain he could afford that dismissal. "Someone got to him first," he said at last, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees purely from the flatness of his tone. No theater in it at all, which was, his followers had learned, always the more dangerous register. Someone with an interest in the same trail I am walking. Find out who. I do not care what it costs or how many favors you must call in from corners of this world I have expressly forbidden you to associate with. I built 7 anchors against death because death is the only enemy I have ever respected enough to prepare for twice. I will not discover at the 11th hour of a war I intend to win that some other hand reached the last piece of the old story before mine did." He turned away, dismissing the man without another word, and stood a long while at the window behind drawn curtains, looking at nothing, thinking about permanence and legends and the particular gnawing discomfort of being, for the first time in a great many years, uncertain who else might already be ahead of him in a race he had not known he was running until just now. He requested the meeting himself, which was new. He'd spent 5 years being summoned to that office. This time he sent a note up with a first-year prefect and stood outside the gargoyle until it stepped aside, unsummoned, on his own initiative, and found Dumbledore not particularly surprised to see him. "I know you have the Elder Wand," Harry said before he'd even fully crossed the threshold. No preamble. He'd decided walking up that preamble was a kindness he was no longer certain he owed. The 1945 duel. Grindelwald. "I know." Something moved behind Dumbledore's eyes, quick and old and, for once, entirely without theater. "You have been thorough. I've had a good teacher in it. You spent 5 years teaching me to find things nobody wants found." Harry crossed the rest of the room and stood in front of the desk rather than taking the chair, which he understood, distantly, was itself a kind of statement. "Voldemort's looking for it. Snape told the Order 3 days ago. He's hunting Gregorovitch's death, the duel, the whole trail I just walked. He doesn't have the ending yet. He will, eventually, if somebody with the ending doesn't do something about it first. And you believe that somebody is you. I believe it can't be you. Not anymore." He let that sit a moment, watching it land. "You've held onto it for 60 years and never used it for anything but keeping it out of worse hands. That's not nothing, but it's not enough anymore either, is it? A wand like that sitting in a drawer isn't safety. It's a countdown until somebody clever enough finds where you put it." He took a slow breath, the first hesitation he'd allowed himself since walking in. "I want it, not as a gift. I'm not asking you to hand it to me because you feel guilty or because you think it'll fix what's between us. I want to take it the way the story says it has to be taken. Properly. Earned. And the other two," Dumbledore said. It wasn't quite a question. "You are not describing a single theft, Harry. You have read the same tale I have. You are describing a collection." Harry didn't flinch from it. He'd expected the old man to see the shape of the whole plan the moment he saw any piece of it. That was, after all, precisely why he'd waited 6 weeks to bring any of it into this office. "I already have the cloak. It's been mine since I was 11. There's a third thing, and I have a reasonably good idea where it is, and I'm not going to tell you the rest of it today because I think if I did, you'd spend the next month trying to talk me out of the parts that frighten you. And I don't have a month of that argument in me right now. You intend to become the Master of Death." Hearing it said aloud in that voice, in that office, landed differently than it had in his own head, alone, in the circular chamber the castle had built him where he'd first let himself think it. "Yes. Do you understand what you are truly asking of that word? Not the fairy tale. The thing underneath it. No?" Harry said, honestly, because he'd decided somewhere in the last month that honesty, even the unflattering kind, was the only currency he had left that Dumbledore couldn't second-guess. "Not fully. I don't think anyone alive does, or the story would have a different shape than 3 brothers and a moral about restraint. But I know what I'm not going to be, which is enough to start with." I'm not going to be spent by someone else's plan. Whatever the rest of it costs, I'd rather pay it choosing than pay it not choosing. Which is what you've had me doing since I was 11 months old. Apparently, without my ever once getting a vote, something crossed Dumbledore's face that might, in a kinder light, have been read as pride and might, in a harder one, have been read as fear. And Harry suspected, watching it, that it was honestly both at once, the way most true things about that office had turned out to be both at once. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, turning something over behind eyes that had gone very still. You understand what you were describing. A duel. A duel in earnest, Harry. Not a lesson. If the wand's allegiance is to pass by the old law rather than by gift, it must pass by genuine defeat, and I will not insult either of us by performing one for your benefit. If we do this, I will not go easy on you, and there is a version of this conversation in which that goes very badly for you indeed. I know. You are 16. I know that too. Harry held his gaze, level, unhurried. The anger he might once have brought to this room long since burned down into something colder and more useful. You've told me I've carried more than any child should have to carry. You said it yourself, a month ago in this office. If that's true, then you already know I'm not asking you as a child asking a favor. I'm asking you as whatever I've become instead. Give me a real chance to take it, or tell me plainly that you'll never let it go, and I'll know exactly where we stand going forward. Dumbledore studied him for a long time. Longer than the question strictly required, the way a man studies a door he has spent decades assuming he'd never have to walk through. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the last of its performance, gone plain and quiet and, for the first time since Harry had known him, entirely without an angle. Dawn. Tomorrow. The 7th floor will provide us a room suited to the purpose, and privacy besides. I will bring the wand. You will bring whatever you have learned this term that you have not yet shown me, and I confess I am curious what that amounts to. A pause. Something that might have been the ghost of the old warmth flickering once, briefly, before it settled back into resolve. I want you to understand, before we begin, that I do not do this out of guilt, or out of some tidy wish to balance a scale between us. I do this because you found the answer on your own, in 6 weeks, to a question that took the finest minds of the last war considerably longer, and because a wand that has already half chosen its next master, whether either of us wishes it or not, is more dangerous sitting unclaimed than it is settled. The wand knows, Harry. It is known since the moment you decided to come and ask for it honestly rather than steal it in the night, which you could have attempted and did not. That decision has already cost me the argument, whatever happens tomorrow at Wand Point. The room of requirement gave them, at Harry's asking, a bare stone chamber with a high vaulted ceiling and nothing in it but gray morning light through arrow-slit windows too narrow to see through properly, the kind of room built for exactly one purpose and nothing else. Dumbledore was waiting when Harry arrived, robes plain, the elder wand. When he drew it, unremarkable to look at, pale, knotted, older than it looked, no different at a glance from 100 wands in Ollivander's stockroom. Harry had expected it to look like something. It didn't. Power, he was learning, rarely announced itself with decor. Rules, Dumbledore said. Businesslike now, the last of the previous night's gravity folded away somewhere Harry couldn't see. No unforgivables from either of us, which I state for form's sake and because I trust you already knew it. First disarming ends the engagement. I will not hold back out of sentiment, and I ask that you extend me the same respect. Understood. They bowed, the old formality absurd and exact in the empty room, and then Dumbledore moved. Harry had sparred with Order members, had survived duels with actual Death Eaters in a ministry corridor a year and a half ago, had thought he understood what it meant to face a wizard who outmatched him. He understood, within 4 seconds of the engagement beginning, that he had understood nothing. Dumbledore's spell work came without incantation, without visible strain, a sequence of transfigurations and shield work so fluid it barely registered as separate spells at all. More like weather changing around Harry than magic being cast at him. A jet of violet light became, mid-flight, a flock of stone birds that scattered and reformed into a net. The floor rippled underfoot without warning, and Harry had to throw himself sideways into a roll he'd practiced exactly once, badly, in a room of requirement session with Ron 3 weeks earlier, and only the muscle memory of that single practice kept him upright. He did not try to outpower Dumbledore. He'd known, walking in, that the attempt would be suicide, and some careful, tactical part of him, the part that had spent 6 weeks learning to think in sightlines and warning times, had already decided the terms on which this fight could actually be won. He needed Dumbledore to spend himself on a version of Harry that didn't exist anymore. Reckless, straightforward, the 11-year-old who'd once run headlong at Quirrell and Voldemort, both because running headlong was the only tool he'd owned. He gave Dumbledore 3 exchanges of exactly that impression. Retreating, shielding late, casting hot and obvious, and washed Dumbledore's spellwork ease, fractionally, unconsciously, into the rhythm of a teacher managing a student, rather than a duelist meeting an equal. The first exchange cost him a burn along one forearm where a stinging hex he'd shielded a half-second too slow found skin instead of fabric. He let the pain register on his face openly because a duelist hiding pain badly was one more piece of evidence for the performance he was building. The second exchange he lost more ground than he needed to, backing toward the chamber's east wall in a retreat that looked like fear and was, in fact, measurement, 3 long strides that let him clock the exact distance between himself and the spot on the flagstones he intended to use. The third exchange, he threw a stunner wide and obvious, arm too far extended, the kind of mistake a frightened 16-year-old made under pressure, and watched Dumbledore's counter come a fraction slower than the two before it, an old duelist's economy of effort settling in against an opponent his instincts had already, quietly, stopped rating as a genuine threat. That was the moment Harry had been building toward since the first night alone in this room. Not a weakness in Dumbledore's magic, which had none that Harry could find or exploit. A weakness in Dumbledore's read of him. 60 years of pattern recognition trained on duelists who fought the way duelists were supposed to fight. Escalating, committing, telegraphing effort before spending it. Harry had spent 3 weeks teaching his own body to do the opposite. And on the fourth exchange, he dropped the performance entirely. He'd spent 3 weeks alone in this same room on other nights, building a single sequence and nothing else, over and over, until his body could produce it without his mind supervising the details. A nonverbal protego angled not to block but to deflect, redirecting an incoming curse 30 degrees off its line into the flagstones at Dumbledore's own feet, timed to the half-second where a caster's attention is already committed to the spell after next. The floor exploded upward in a controlled shatter of stone shards that weren't dangerous, precisely, but were sudden and disorienting, and cost Dumbledore a fraction of a second he had not budgeted for in 60 years of duels against opponents who had never once managed to make him flinch. In the gap that fraction of a second bought him, Harry didn't attack. He banished. Not at Dumbledore. At the wand itself, a targeted, silent Accio he'd practiced on lesser wands 100 times that October until the spell felt less like a spell than a reflex, aimed with a precision born of knowing exactly where Dumbledore's hand would be. A heartbeat after the shattering floor pulled his balance a few crucial degrees off true. The Elder Wand tore free of Dumbledore's fingers and crossed the space between them in a single spinning arc, and Harry's hand closed around it before either of them had finished processing that the engagement was over. The silence afterward had a texture to it. Thick and total, broken only by settling dust and the sound of 2 people breathing. "Well," Dumbledore said, at last, and there was something in his voice Harry had never heard there before, not quite pride and not quite grief, but some third thing assembled from both. "That was not the student I taught occlumency to a year ago." "No," Harry agreed. He looked down at the wand in his hand. It felt no different, at first, from his own. From holly and phoenix feather worn smooth by 5 years of use. And then, a heartbeat later, it did feel different. A warmth spreading up through his palm and wrist that had nothing to do with temperature. An unmistakable, wordless sense of a very old and very tired thing settling, finally, into hands it approved of. He'd read the theory a dozen times in the last 6 weeks. He hadn't expected it to feel like being recognized. "How does it feel?" Dumbledore asked, and the question had none of the clinical distance Harry might have expected. It sounded, instead, like genuine curiosity from a man who had carried that wand for 60 years and never once, by his own account, felt anything from it beyond raw capability. Harry considered the question honestly before he answered it. Like it was waiting. "They generally are," Dumbledore said. "That is, I have come to believe, the tragedy of the thing. It does not care who wins. It only wants, eventually, someone who will hold it without being consumed by it. And it has been sorely disappointed on that count for rather a long time." He straightened, and some of the old warmth crept back into his face, tired but genuine. "I will not ask for it back, Harry. That would undo the only clean thing that has happened between us this term. But I will ask you, once, and then never again, do you understand what you are choosing to become? Not the wand. The path the wand is part of." "I think so. Tell me." Harry turned the Elder Wand over once in his hand, feeling its unfamiliar balance, its strange, patient warmth. "I'm not going to be anyone's weapon. Not yours. Not the prophecies. Not even Voldemort's if I can help it, though I suppose in a way I already am, whether I like it or not." He looked up. "There's a third Hallow that isn't spoken for yet, and a fourth thing I need to do that I'm not ready to explain to you, because I don't think you'd let me try it if I told you now, and I need you not stopping me more than I need your blessing. I'm not planning to run at Voldemort with a stronger wand and hope for the best. I'm planning to change what winning even means." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and Harry watched something settle in the old man's face. Resignation, and something that might, in a better lit room, have looked almost like hope. "Then I will tell you what I told myself, the morning after Godric's Hollow, when I first understood what kind of a war this was going to be, and what it was likely to cost the people fighting it. I will not stop you from choosing your own weight to carry. I have spent this whole conversation, and a good portion of the last month, learning what it costs to make that choice for someone else." He held out his hand, not for the wand, but simply to be taken, an old man's offer of something more fragile than trust and harder to name. "Go carefully, Harry. Whatever you are building, build it with your eyes open. That is the only advice I have left that I still believe in." Harry shook his hand and meant it, and understood. walking out of the room of requirement with the Elder Wand a warm, patient weight against his palm. That something between them had ended and something else, smaller and colder and more honest, had begun in its place. He spent the rest of that morning alone in an unused classroom on the 4th floor, door locked, curtains drawn against a corridor full of students heading down to breakfast, none the wiser about what had happened 3 floors above their heads before dawn. He set both wands on the desk in front of him, holly and phoenix feather beside pale, knotted, unglamorous wood, and looked at them a long while before he picked either one up. He tried his own wand first. It answered the way it always had, warm and familiar as an old coat, a lumos kindling at the tip without any conscious thought behind the word. Then he set it down and picked up the Elder Wand and cast the same small, unremarkable spell, and the light that answered was not merely brighter. It was steadier somehow, a flame that didn't gutter even when he deliberately jostled his own hand to test it, as though the wand itself had simply decided that flickering was beneath it. He tried 3 more spells, each more advanced than the last, and each came easier than it should have, easier than 5 years of practice had any right to make it, and somewhere around the 4th spell, he made himself stop, because the ease itself had started to feel like an argument being made in his hand, a soft, persistent case for trying the 5th spell, and the 6th, and however many more it would take before he'd use the wand for something he hadn't actually decided to do. He thought about the first brother in the story, dead within the year, throat cut in his sleep by a man who'd wanted the wand for himself and had simply taken it, because a wand that could not lose a duel had never once promised its owner he couldn't be murdered by someone patient enough not to duel him at all. He thought about how easy it would be, holding this, to start believing himself untouchable and understood, sitting alone in the cold classroom with morning light coming gray through the curtains, that the wand's actual gift wasn't power. Power he'd more or less had access to for years, in smaller doses, at greater cost. The gift, and the danger both, was how natural the power felt. How little it asked of him to keep reaching for more of it. He set himself a rule, right there, alone in the cold classroom, and said it aloud once so it would feel like a promise rather than a passing thought. The Elder Wand for duels that mattered and nothing smaller. Not for Alohomora on a stuck door. Not for a shortcut through a tedious essay's research. Not for anything that his own wand, honestly and patiently practiced, could already manage. He understood, setting the rule, that the discipline of it would matter considerably more than any single spell he might have cast that morning, because the whole danger of the thing had never been the wand's power at all. It had always been the slow, comfortable erosion of every reason he might once have had for choosing the harder path instead of the easier one. He thought that was probably true of the other 2 Hallows as well, waiting somewhere out past the edges of what he currently understood, and made a private note to hold the same rule against them both, whenever they finally came into his hands. He put the Elder Wand away first, wrapped in a strip of old cloth at the bottom of his trunk under Sirius's moth-holed robes, and kept his own wand in his pocket for the walk down to breakfast, because some decisions were worth making twice, and this one felt worth making with his hands as well as his head. Snape found him at the Slytherin table's end of the corridor after breakfast, which was unusual enough on its own that Harry stopped walking before Snape had said a word. The black eyes did their familiar cataloging, quicker than usual, more thorough. "You are standing differently," Snape said, without preamble, in the tone of a man noting a fact rather than offering an observation. "I don't imagine you'd care to tell me why." "Not particularly, sir." "No, I didn't imagine you would." A pause, and something in Snape's face shifted fractionally into an expression Harry had no name for and had certainly never been offered before. The headmaster looked, this morning, like a man who has lost an argument he is relieved to have lost. That is not an expression I have seen him wear in 20 years of knowing him. "Whatever you have done, Potter, I find I am obscurely pleased by it," which is not a sentence I expected to say to you in this lifetime, and I would ask you not to make me repeat it. He turned to go, then paused, half over his shoulder. "Try not to get yourself killed with whatever you have found. I did not deliver that particular piece of unpleasant honesty a month ago so that you could go and be reckless with it." "I'll try, sir." "See that you do." And he was gone, robes snapping around the corner, leaving Harry standing in a corridor full of students heading to first lesson, feeling, for reasons he couldn't entirely account for, steadier than he had in weeks. He told Ron and Hermione that night, in the common room after everyone else had gone up. The fire burned down to embers and the portrait hole shut fast against the cold. He promised Hermione a full account, and he gave her one. The whole shape of it, from the book in Sirius's trunk to the duel that morning, watching her face cycle through disbelief and alarm and, at the very end, something that looked almost like recognition, as if a puzzle she'd been half-assembling herself for weeks had finally been handed its last few pieces. "You want to become the Master of Death," she said when he'd finished, in the careful, flat voice she used when she was testing whether saying a thing aloud made it sound as mad as she suspected it might. "I want to stop being anybody's instrument. This is how." Ron, who had said almost nothing through the entire account, was looking at the wand where it lay on the table between them, pale and ordinary and utterly unlike the weight of history it carried. "Bloody hell, Harry," he said at last, with the particular reverence he usually reserved for genuinely spectacular Quidditch plays. "You dueled Dumbledore. And won. That's what you took from all of that." "I took several things from all of that, mate. Give me a minute. I'm processing them in order of how much they terrify me, and the duel's currently winning." He glanced up, and under the humor there was something steadier, something that had been there since the library corridor a month before. "What do you need?" Hermione hadn't finished, though. She was looking at the wand with a particular suspicion she reserved for a book she thought was lying to her. "Harry, the story isn't only a story about the third brother winning, it's a story about the first two losing, specifically because the gifts gave them exactly enough rope. You're telling me you understand the danger, and I believe that you believe it, but understanding a danger and being immune to it aren't the same thing, and I need you to actually hear the difference, not just agree with me so I'll stop talking." "I heard it this morning," Harry said, alone, with both wands on a desk, before either of you knew any of this happened. "I'm not going to pretend the pull isn't real. It is. It's already real, and I've had it for about 6 hours." He met her eyes, steady, and let her see that he meant it, rather than simply saying it to end the conversation. "That's exactly why I'm telling you both everything now, instead of waiting until I've collected all three and it's too late for either of you to talk sense into me. I don't trust myself to always want to hear it. I trust you two to say it anyway." That seemed to settle something in her, the tight line of her shoulders easing by degrees, and she reached out and closed her hand briefly over his on the table, not quite gripping it, just present. "All right," she said, "then we do this properly. Together, no more disappearing into libraries at midnight without telling us where you've gone. Deal." "And Harry," Ron added, with the air of a man delivering the genuinely important part of the evening's proceedings at last, "next time you're planning to duel the most powerful wizard alive before sunrise, maybe give us a bit more warning than a note that just says busy tomorrow. Tell you later." Hermione nearly hexed a first year out of sheer nerves. "I did not. You looked like you wanted to." Harry felt something in his chest ease that had been drawn tight since well before the duel, since the library corridor, since the night in Sirius's room with the fire burning low and a book of children's stories open on his knees, and understood, watching the two of them bicker gently over a table with the most dangerous wand in the world lying between them like an oddly shaped centerpiece, that whatever came next, he wasn't going to be walking into it alone after all. "I need you to help me find the second one," he said, when the bickering had run its course. "There's a ring. I think I know exactly whose hand it's on." Chapter 2, End. Chapter 3, The Gaunt Shack. 2 weeks passed after the duel in a rhythm Harry had almost forgotten was available to him. Classes, meals, Quidditch practice under a sky gone the color of old pewter, evenings in the common room that belonged to nothing more urgent than homework, and Ron's increasingly elaborate theories about what the Elder Wand's presence in Harry's trunk might do to the dormitory's other occupants if it ever woke up cross about something. Hermione had taken to the research with the particular ferocity she reserved for problems she could actually solve, cross-referencing everything Harry had found about the Purvells against 3 centuries of goblin property records, on the theory, unstated but obvious to everyone at the table, that keeping her hands busy with facts was easier than sitting with the parts of this that weren't factual at all. It was, in its own strange way, close to peace. Harry recognized it as such, and recognized too that it wouldn't last, the way a held breath doesn't last, useful and necessary and always, eventually, spent. Dumbledore summoned him in the second week of November, and this time the note that arrived at breakfast said only, in the old man's narrow, slanting hand, "I believe it is time you saw the ring." Harry read it twice before he understood what it meant, and then went very still over his porridge, because in 6 weeks of careful research, he had never once had to ask where the second Hallow was. He had simply known, the way you know a fact you've been circling without letting yourself land on it, a golden ring set with a black stone, cracked down the middle, taken from a dead man's house and turned into a monument to a war Dumbledore had fought largely alone. He folded the note into his pocket and went to the office directly after breakfast, Hermione's eyes tracking him the length of the Gryffindor table without a word passing between them. She'd learned, over the past month, when to let him go and when to follow. This, her expression said, was a day for letting him go. The gargoyle stepped aside before Harry reached it. Dumbledore was waiting behind the desk with the ring already sitting on a square of black velvet in front of him, catching the gray November light through the tall windows in a way that made the stone at its center look less like jewelry and more like a held breath. "You did not tell me," Harry said before he'd even taken the chair, "that you already had it." "No," Dumbledore said, "I did not." There was no defensiveness in it, no immediate rush to explain, and Harry recognized with the particular clarity that had become familiar to him since October that the old man had learned something from the wand, some lesson about the cost of managed silence that he was now, deliberately, trying not to repeat. "I retrieved it over the summer before you arrived at Hogwarts, from a house in a village called Little Hangleton, where a family named Gaunt lived and died in circumstances I would not wish on anyone. It cost me this." He raised his right hand, and Harry saw properly, for the first time, what he had only glimpsed before in flashes across the desk. Skin gone black and dead-looking from the fingertips to the wrist, a wound that had the wrongness of something that would never heal, only spread, slowly, on its own schedule. "You didn't destroy it." "No. Why not?" Dumbledore was quiet a moment, turning the black stone toward the window, the light itself seeming to help him find the right words. Because I recognized what it was the moment I touched it, and recognition in this particular case came with a temptation. I did not entirely trust myself to survive unsupervised. He looked up. You have read the tale, Harry. You know what the second brother did with it and what it cost him. I am considerably older than the second brother was, and I told myself at first that age had made me wiser than he. I have since come to suspect that age had merely made me better at disguising the same wanting and more respectable language. Something cold moved through Harry's chest, recognition of a kind he hadn't expected. You wanted to use it. I wanted, Dumbledore said. And here, for the first time in 5 years, Harry heard something in the old man's voice crack open, a seam finally giving under pressure that had clearly been building far longer than a single summer, to see my sister again. Ariana. I have not spoken her name to you before, and I find, now that I have begun, that I am not entirely certain how to stop. He set the ring down, gently. The care of a man setting down something that might still be listening. She died when I was a young man, in a duel I helped provoke. Between myself and my brother and a friend I loved more unwisely than I have loved anything before or since. His name was Gellert Grindelwald, and before he was the wizard your generation has been taught to fear, he was 17 years old and dazzlingly clever, and the two of us spent one summer, the summer after I lost my mother and inherited my sister's care, planning to conquer the world for its own good. He was quiet a moment, looking not at Harry, but at some middle distance decades deep. You must understand what it was to be young and brilliant, and suddenly, unexpectedly burdened, Harry, in a way perhaps only you of everyone I have ever taught might genuinely understand. I had won every prize this school had to offer. I was expected by everyone, including myself, to go out into the world and do something remarkable with the mind I had been given. Instead, I found myself keeping house for a sister the world had damaged in ways I still do not fully understand, and a brother who blamed me, not entirely unfairly, for not being enough to hold our family together after our mother died. And then Gellert arrived, staying with his great aunt in the village, and for one summer I had someone who looked at me and saw exactly the future I had been promised and denied, and who had ideas, Harry, extraordinary ideas, about a world reordered for its own good, wizards no longer hiding from the very people we might have helped, and I let myself believe, for a handful of golden weeks, that I could have both things, the brilliant future and the sister who needed me, that I did not have to choose. The Hallows were part of it, the centerpiece of it. Gellert had found an old reference, much as you found your book in a dead man's trunk, and became convinced, as only the very young and very clever become convinced of anything, that the Hallows were real and findable, and that whoever held them would hold, by extension, the moral authority to remake the world exactly as we saw fit. We called it for the greater good, Harry. We used to sign our letters to each other with those words, as if repeating a phrase enough times could turn a hunger for power into a philosophy. His mouth twisted. Old grief given a shape too tired to be called bitter. We never found the wand or the stone that summer. We found instead a duel we did not intend. 3 wands and 3 curses in a garden at dusk. My brother Aberforth furious and grieving in advance of the grief he was about to earn. Gellert and I too proud and too frightened to simply stop. And my sister, who should never have been anywhere near it, dead on the ground between us before any of us fully understood what we had done. To this day neither Gellert nor I have ever been entirely certain whose curse struck her. He let that sit in the room a long moment, the silver instruments ticking softly on their tables. Fawkes silent and watchful on his perch. That is the debt I have been paying, in one form or another, for the better part of 60 years. That is why I did not destroy this ring the moment I found it. I held it in my hand and I thought of Ariana, and for one terrible extended moment, Harry, I very nearly turned it 3 times and said her name. What stopped you? Fawkes, Dumbledore said, and something almost like a smile moved across his face, brief and sad. He does not approve of grief used as an excuse for foolishness. He has a way of making his opinions known without a word spoken, and I have learned, over the centuries of our acquaintance, to take them seriously. I put the ring down. I sealed it against my own future weakness with every ward I could construct, and I decided that I would need help I could trust to finish what I had started, and then I spent 4 months telling myself I had not yet found the right moment to ask for it. He looked at Harry directly. I'm asking now, not because I believe you immune to the same temptation. I watched you hold the Elder Wand a month ago and understood, better than anyone alive, precisely how that particular seduction works. I am asking because you have already proven, twice now, that you will tell me the truth about your own weaknesses rather than let me discover them after the damage is done, and that is, I have come to believe, worth considerably more than immunity. Harry sat with all of it a long moment, the fire in the grate the only sound besides Fawkes shifting on his perch. He had spent 2 months building a private, unspoken comparison between himself at 16 and this same man at 17, both of them reaching for the Hallows out of a hunger that felt, from the inside, like clarity rather than danger, and he made himself ask the question he'd been avoiding since October, because avoiding it would have made him exactly the kind of coward he'd promised Ron and Hermione he wouldn't become. Do you think I'm doing what you did with Grindelwald? Telling myself it's different because I've called it by its real name instead of dressing it up. I have asked myself that question every day since you first said the word Hallows to me, Dumbledore said, without hesitation, which told Harry more than a careful answer would have. I do not think you are 17 and star for a future you were promised and denied. I do not think you have found someone who flatters your ambition and calls it philosophy. But I would be lying to you, Harry, and I have decided I am finished lying to you even gently, if I did not tell you that the shape of the wanting is the same. It always is. That is what the story is actually warning against, I think, more than any specific object. Not the stone or the wand themselves. The particular ease with which an extraordinary mind convinces itself that its own hunger is a form of wisdom. He held Harry's gaze, steady, unflinching. The difference, so far as I can tell it, is this. Gellert and I built our plan in secret, told no one, and grew angry at anyone who questioned it, because the questioning felt like an insult to how clearly we believed we saw the world. You had told two friends everything. You told me. You are, this very moment, sitting in this office asking a dangerous old man whether he thinks you have gone wrong, which is not a question either of us ought to ask ourselves at your age, and I have come to believe it is the single most important difference between a man who becomes a monster and a man who does not. They didn't destroy the Horcrux that day. Dumbledore was careful to explain why in the flat, precise voice he used for genuinely dangerous magical theory. The fragment of soul lodged in the stone had bound itself, over years of dormant occupation, to the older enchantment already present in the ring, the true Peverell working that let it call the dead. Sever it carelessly and the two magics might tear each other apart, destroying stone and soul fragment both in a backlash neither of them wanted to be standing near when it happened. What they needed was a blade or venom capable of destroying a Horcrux outright, applied with a precision fine enough to touch the parasite without touching the house it had made of another power's architecture. Basilisk venom, Harry said, and watched Dumbledore's eyebrows rise, fractionally, the closest the old man came these days to open surprise. It's the only thing I know of that destroys a Horcrux clean. Fiendfire works too, but Fiendfire doesn't know the difference between a soul fragment and the hand holding it, and I'm not setting uncontrolled cursed fire loose anywhere near something I actually want to keep in one piece. You are thinking of the chamber. There's a 60-foot basilisk skeleton under this school with fangs still sharp enough to kill a diary in about 4 seconds, sir. I was there. I'd rather use a tool I already understand than invent one from scratch and hope it behaves. And the precision. Venom destroys indiscriminately, Harry, whatever it touches. A drop misapplied and you have destroyed the stone along with its passenger. I know. Harry hesitated, choosing the next park carefully because it was the park he'd worked out alone over 3 sleepless nights and had not yet said aloud to anyone, not even Ron and Hermione. The Gaunts were Slytherin's last line. Parseltongue ran in that family the way red hair runs in the Weasleys, and whatever curse work they built into this ring to guard it would have been key to that, at least in part. I think I can talk to it. Not the Horcrux, the ring itself, the old protection under Voldemort's addition. I think if I do this at the source, in the house it was made to guard, with the venom and the right words and the right language, I can ask the guardian magic to hold the two enchantments apart just long enough for the venom to find only the piece that doesn't belong there. Dumbledore studied him for a long moment, weighing something Harry couldn't fully read. You intend to perform an act of applied dark curse theory in Parseltongue, in a condemned house, on a magical object actively hostile to being separated from part of itself, on the strength of a theory you developed alone at 2 in the morning. Yes, that is either extraordinarily reckless or extraordinarily well-reasoned, and I confess I have not yet decided which. A pause and then quieter. I would like to be present, not to perform the working. I believe, on reflection, that this is not mine to perform, and I have grown considerably more careful about deciding what belongs to whom without asking. But I would like to be present, Harry, if you'll allow it, both because the magic you are describing is dangerous enough to want a second wand nearby, and because I find I do not wish to send you to that house alone, whatever debt of trust stands between us. Harry thought about it, weighing his own instinct towards solitude against the plain fact that Dumbledore, for all his 60 years of careful evasions, was still the most powerful wizard he had ever stood beside, and that pride was not a currency he could afford to spend on refusing help freely offered. All right, he said, but I do the working, you watch. Agreed. He went for the Fang that same evening and asked Ron to come with him, partly because the girls' bathroom entrance to the chamber required a second wand at the ready in case anything down there had changed in 4 years, and partly because he'd promised, back in October, that he wouldn't disappear into the dangerous parts of this alone. And he intended to keep that promise even when keeping it was inconvenient. Moaning Myrtle wept theatrically over the state of her plumbing when they arrived, and brightened considerably at the sight of Harry, which Ron found more unsettling than anything they were about to walk into. The sink hissed open at a word in a language Harry no longer had to think about producing, and the pipe beneath swallowed them both into a long, foul-smelling slide that ended, as it always had, in a floor littered with small animal bones and the particular damp cold of a place that never saw the sun. The chamber itself hadn't changed in 4 years. Not really, though it seemed smaller now. The way places from childhood always did on returning, the great stone faces along the walls no less unsettling for being familiar. green torchlight woke along the columns as they passed, sluggish and ancient, throwing long moving shadows across a floor that still, faintly, showed the drag marks where a 12-year-old Harry had once hauled Ginny's unconscious weight toward a way out he hadn't been certain existed. He hadn't expected the memory to arrive with any force. It arrived anyway, brief and total, and he let it pass through him rather than fighting it, because fighting memories he'd learned over the autumn cost more than simply letting them finish. The basilisk skeleton lay where it had fallen, vast and pale, and up close, oddly dignified in its stillness, an old god's ribcage arching over them into shadow. Vertebrae the size of cauldrons receding away into a dark the torchlight didn't reach, Harry worked one fang free with careful, silent focus, wrapping it in dragonhide the moment it came loose. While Ron stood watch at the chamber's mouth with his own wand raised, saying very little, which from Ron was its own kind of support. Reckonant minds, Ron asked eventually, nodding at the skeleton. Us taking pieces off it. I asked it actually, before we came down. Told it what it was for. Harry turned the fang over once in his gloved hand, considering its wicked ivory length. I don't know if it understood, but it felt wrong not to say something. It killed people. It also didn't ask to be a weapon, any more than most weapons ask. Ron didn't have an answer for that, and didn't try to invent one, which Harry had come, over 5 years, to recognize as one of his oldest friend's quieter gifts. You know, Ron said, as they climbed back up toward the ordinary world, when we were 12, I'd have called this the worst night of my life. Now it's just Tuesday. He glanced sideways and something more serious moved under the joke. You good for tomorrow? The shack, whatever this actually is? I don't know yet, Harry admitted, because he promised honesty and honesty that particular evening, didn't have a more comfortable answer available. Ask me after. Voldemort received the news of his tracker's failure in the same drawing room, the same drawn curtains, 3 days before Harry knelt in the Gaunt's ruined front room with a basilisk fang in his hand and took it, this time, with something closer to stillness than rage, which those closest to him had learned was considerably more dangerous. You are certain, he said, that the trail ends at Little Hangleton. My lord, the village records show a family named Gaunt, extinguished some 60 years past. The last of them, a son, died in Azkaban. There is nothing left there but a ruin, and the ruin has been searched. A pause, careful, measured, the particular caution of a man who had learned exactly how much honesty his master's temper could absorb before it stopped absorbing anything at all. Whatever was once hidden in that house, my lord, it is my belief it has already been moved. Recently. The wards show recent disturbance within the year. Voldemort was silent a long while, turning that fact over with the patient, cold attention of a man assembling a puzzle he did not yet have all the pieces to. He did not know, could never have guessed, that the trail he was chasing belonged to a different Hallow than the one he sought. The Dumbledore's summer visit to a condemned house had nothing to do with wands at all, but the coincidence of it, ruins disturbed, trails gone suddenly cold, and exactly the corners of the old world he'd begun quietly excavating, sat with him uneasily. A suspicion without a shape yet, and he had lived long enough, and lost enough, to know that suspicions without shapes had a way of becoming, eventually, the only warnings a man got. Someone is ahead of me, he said finally to the empty room, because there was no one left in it he trusted enough to say it to directly. I do not yet know who. I intend to find out before they finish whatever they are building. The Gaunt shack sat at the end of an overgrown lane outside a village that had, by every account Harry had read, gone out of its way to forget the family who'd once lived there. And Harry understood why within 30 seconds of standing in front of it. The house crouched into its own hillside like something ashamed of being seen, windows boarded, roof half collapsed, a smell of rot and old magic hanging over the whole plot that made the hair on Harry's arms rise before he'd even crossed the threshold. They had apparated to the village outskirts at Dumbledore's insistence, walking the last half-mile on foot along a lane gone to bramble and rusted fencing, past the ruin of what must once have been a low stone wall and a gate hanging from a single hinge, with a nailed-up snake's skull still visible above it, weathered nearly featureless by decades of rain. Nobody in the village, so far as Harry could tell, walking through it, had any memory left of the family that had lived at the lane's end, and something about that particular kind of forgetting, complete and undramatic, settled into his chest with more weight than he'd expected. Voldemort's mother had grown up in that hovel, unloved, unremarkable to anyone who'd known her, and had died in a London orphanage, naming her son for a father who'd never once looked back. Harry thought, walking the last stretch of overgrown path, that he understood something new about the shape of the man he was eventually going to have to end. Some piece of the puzzle that no lesson in Dumbledore's office had ever quite supplied. Not sympathy. He was careful, deliberately, not to let it become that. Just a colder, clearer sense of the particular soil this whole war had grown out of. Dumbledore cleared the worst of the wards with 3 economical gestures, old magic answering old magic, and then stood back at the edge of what had once been a garden and let Harry walk the rest of the way alone. Inside, the single room was smaller than Harry had pictured, low-ceilinged, cluttered with the wreckage of a life lived in poverty and pride in equal, poisonous measure. A stove gone to rust, a wall hung with dead snakeskins, a chair with a cushion rotted through to its frame. He set the ring on a bare patch of table in the room's center, drew the basilisk fang from the dragonhide pouch he'd carried it in since the previous night, and knelt in front of it the way you'd kneel in front of something that deserved a kind of respect, even in its ruin. He spoke to it first, not in English. The words came the way Parselton always came, not translated but simply understood, arriving in his mouth already shaped, a hissing, sinuous cadence he'd have been ashamed of once and had stopped, somewhere in the last 2 months, being ashamed of it all. "I am not here to take what is yours," he told the ring, and felt fatally ridiculous saying it, and said it anyway because ridiculous had stopped mattering the moment real danger entered the room. "I am here to take what does not belong to you. Hold what is old. Let go what is recent." Nothing happened, for a long moment, except the ordinary silence of a ruined house at midday, dust turning slow in a shaft of gray light through a gap in the boarded window. Then the black stone at the ring center shivered, once, a movement too small to be visual and too large to be imagined, and Harry felt something in the room's magic shift, an old, patient attention turning toward him. The way a door turns on a hinge that hasn't moved in years. He didn't know, afterward, precisely how to describe what happened next to anyone who hadn't been in the room, and in the end he never fully tried, not even with Ron and Hermione. The ring's guardian magic, older than Voldemort, older than the Gaunt's whole miserable inbred decline, recognized something in the shape of his request, or in the blood behind it. Peveril blood, however diluted and however many generations removed, still legible to magic old enough to remember when the name had meant something other than a footnote. It didn't speak back, not in words. It simply, slowly, began to withdraw from around the darker thing tangled inside it, the way a hand might ease back from something it had been unconsciously gripping, leaving the parasite exposed, and momentarily, terribly alone in the space the older magic had vacated. Harry felt the exact instant it was ready. It arrived not as a thought but as a certainty, absolute and wordless, the same kind of certainty that had once told him which direction a snitch was about to break. He drove the basilisk fang down into the black stone with a single motion. Controlled, precise, no more force than the moment required and not 1 ounce less. The sound the ring made was not a sound at all. Not really. More a pressure behind Harry's own eyes and teeth, a wrongness given brief physical shape that made him understand, distantly, why Dumbledore's hand had died the way it had. A thread of something black and cold and furious tore itself out of the stone and hung in the air for less than a second. A shape almost like smoke and almost like a face contorted around a scream. It had no mouth to voice, and then it simply wasn't there anymore, unmade, the way the diary's ghost had unmade itself 4 years before under a basilisk fang in a very different chamber. The ring sat on the table, cracked cleanly down its band, the black stone dull now, ordinary looking, a dead man's jewelry and nothing more. Harry knelt there a long moment, breathing, the fang still in his hand, aware of Dumbledore's careful stillness in the doorway behind him, offering nothing, not congratulations, not relief, simply presence, the way you'd stand beside someone who had just crossed something difficult and didn't need to be told they'd crossed it. "It's done," Harry said finally. "Yes," Dumbledore said, "I rather think it is." He held the stone alone that night, back at Hogwarts, in the same circular chamber that had given him privacy the night he'd first said the words Master of Death aloud. He'd asked for solitude and gotten it. The room shrinking down around him into something small and firelit and entirely his own, the ring resting in his open palm where the cracked band no longer mattered because the stone itself had already come loose, freed of its broken setting, small and black and warm from his own skin. He thought about his parents for a long time before he let himself think about turning it. He thought about a photograph in a shoebox he still hadn't managed to look at twice. A woman with his eyes and a man with his hair, both of them younger in the pictures than he was now in every way that mattered except the ways that had gotten them killed. He thought about Sirius, laughing, alive, 3 years distant and permanently out of reach behind an archway that had swallowed him whole and given nothing back. He turned the stone once in his fingers, not yet 3 times, not yet the full working, just once, testing, the way you'd test ice before deciding whether to trust your whole weight to it. The air in the room didn't change, nothing so dramatic as that. But something in his peripheral vision, some quality of the firelight along the far wall, seemed to gather itself, patiently, waiting to see whether he intended to finish what he'd started. He thought about what Dumbledore had said that afternoon in the office, about recognizing his own hunger dressed up as wisdom, and made himself examine, honestly, which one this was. He wanted his parents back the way anyone wanted an amputated limb back. A phantom ache that had never once fully faded, no matter how many years accumulated over it. He wanted Sirius back the way you want an argument unhad, a mistake unmade, a doorway that had never opened onto a veil in the first place. Neither of those ones had anything to do with wisdom. He understood that clearly, sitting there, and understood also that clarity about a temptation was not the same thing as freedom from it. The stone did not care whether his reasons were good, it only waited to see whether his hand would finish the turn. He thought too about the specific cruelty embedded in the old story, the detail everyone skimmed past on the way to the tragedy. The The second brother's bride hadn't come back wrong because the magic was broken. She'd come back exactly as advertised, a shade, a memory given enough shape to ache over, sad and cold and distant, as though separated from him by a veil. He turned that word over once, deliberately, because he suspected the story had chosen it on purpose, long before anyone had built an actual veil in a departmental basement for it to echo against. The stone did not lie about what it offered. It offered exactly what grief always secretly wanted and could never actually have: proximity without presence. A photograph that could almost speak back. He thought of the second brother, and the noose, and a bride brought back cold and sad, and not truly of the world she'd been called into. He thought of Dumbledore's voice cracking over a sister's name after 60 years of practiced control, a wound that had never once closed, because it had never once been allowed to. He understood, sitting there with the stone warm in his palm and the fire burning low, that this particular gift was not for using carelessly, in grief, at the first opportunity that presented itself. It was for later. For the ending he intended to build, deliberately, on his own terms, when he had all three Hallows united and understood, finally, what he was actually asking death to grant him. He closed his hand around the stone before it had finished doing whatever it had been about to do, and the gathering stillness in the room's edges eased back into ordinary firelight, patient, willing to wait. "Not yet," he said, aloud to no one, and put the stone away. Ginny found him before either of them did, in the common room past midnight, the fire long since burned to embers and the rest of Gryffindor Tower asleep around them. She'd taken to noticing his absences the way she'd noticed them over the summer, though she'd stopped asking about them directly somewhere around October, trusting, or deciding to trust, that he'd tell her when there was something tellable. "You look different," she said, curling into the chair across from him, feet tucked beneath her. "Not bad different, just further away than usual and closer at the same time. Does that make sense? More than you'd think. Are you going to tell me? Or is this one of the things I find out after?" From Ron, badly, in a version that's missing half the actual point. He almost laughed, the first time in longer than he could easily place. "I destroyed a piece of Voldemort's soul today, with a basilisk fang, in a dead family's ruined front room." Ginny took that with the particular steadiness she'd earned the hard way at 11, with a diary that had nearly written her out of her own life entirely. "Good," she said, simply, no drama in it. And he understood that of everyone he might have told, she was perhaps the only one who could hear that sentence and feel nothing but a fierce, uncomplicated satisfaction on his behalf, because she of all people knew exactly what those fragments cost the people unlucky enough to carry them. "Was it the ring? How did you know it was a ring?" "I didn't. I guessed. You've had that look about you since Sirius died, like you're carrying something with an edge on it, and you've been holding your left hand differently the last week, favoring it the way you do when you've been gripping something you don't want to drop." She shrugged, easy and unbothered on the surface, though Harry suspected the observation had cost her a great deal of quiet attention over a great many weeks. "I pay attention to you. It's not a secret." He didn't have an answer for that. Not one he trusted himself to say out loud without it turning into something larger than either of them was ready for in a dim common room at midnight. So he simply let the silence hold it instead, and she let him. And for a little while that was enough. "For what it's worth," Ginny said eventually, breaking the quiet without disturbing it. "I don't think you have to decide right now what any of this is. Us, I mean. Whatever's sitting in this common room at midnight." She studied the dying fire rather than him, giving the words somewhere neutral to land. "You've got enough to carry without adding a decision about me to the pile. I'm not going anywhere. I've survived worse than patience." "That's not fair to you." "Probably not," she agreed, easy about it in a way that told him she meant the ease. "But I've decided fair isn't actually the thing I want most out of this year. I'd rather have honest and slow and real whenever you've got room for it than fair and rushed and half paid attention to because you're distracted saving the world." She caught his eye, finally, something steady and unhurried in it. "So, no pressure. Just wanted you to know the offer's still open whenever you're ready to actually take it seriously." He held her gaze a moment and found, examining the offer honestly, that it steadied something in him he hadn't realized needed steadying. "Noted," he said quietly. "I intend to come back to it properly, once I've got a version of myself worth bringing to it." He slept poorly that night, not from nightmares, but from the particular restlessness of a mind still cataloging everything it had just been offered and declined, and woke early enough to watch the sun come up gray and reluctant over the lake before the rest of the tower stirred. He told Ron and Hermione the shape of it the next morning, over a breakfast none of them finished, and watched Hermione's face do something complicated when he describes turning the stone once and stopping. "You could have," she said carefully, "called them, just to see." "I know. Why didn't you?" Harry considered the question honestly, the way he'd been trying to consider everything honestly since a night in October with 2 wands on a desk in front of him, because I don't think just to see is a real category with that stone. I think it either costs you nothing because you understand exactly what you're doing and why, or it cost you everything because you didn't. I'm not ready to know which one it would have been for me. Not yet. He looked between them, and something steadied in his chest, the same steadying he'd felt weeks before, over a wand lying between 3 cups of cold tea. 2 Hallows. 1 left. The cloak's already yours, Ron said slowly, working it through. So the third one isn't a hunt at all, it's just putting them together. That's the part I understand least, Harry admitted. I know what the story says happens. I don't know what it actually feels like, or costs, or what death is actually going to want from me once I've done it. He looked down at his hands, steady now in a way they hadn't quite been a month ago. I suppose I'm about to find out. Hermione had gone very quiet, the particular quiet she wore when she was working a problem she didn't like the shape of. Have you thought about when? Not the how. I trust you've thought about the how more than any of us. But the when. You could wait. Finish the year. Let us help you research whatever this union actually involves before you attempt it, instead of walking into it the way you walked into the shack, mostly on instinct and a theory you built at 2 in the morning. I've thought about it. Harry turned his teacup slowly on its saucer, watching the cold liquid inside it settle. But every week, I wait as a week, Voldemort's still hunting the same trail I already finished walking. Snape's reports keep coming. He hasn't found Gregorovich's ghost yet, or worked out where the wand actually went, but he's getting closer, and closer people get. The more of them start dying to keep him from getting closer still. I'm not in a position to sit on 2/3 of the Hallows and pretend that's the same as safety. It's a countdown, same as the wand was. I'd rather finish the sequence on a night I choose than have Voldemort force my hand on a night he does. That's not really an answer to when, though, Hermione said, gently, but with the persistence that had gotten her top marks in every subject she'd ever sat an exam for. That's an answer to why not to wait forever. I'm asking for an actual date because I would like, if it's at all possible, to have read everything there is to read about what happens to a person's magic when they attempt something that hasn't been deliberately, successfully attempted in recorded history before you attempt it. Harry looked at her and felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Gratitude he didn't have a tidy way to voice. Give me a fortnight. I want to make sure the cloak's ready too. Not just carried around like a jumper, actually understood the way I've come to understand the other 2. And I want you to have your fortnight of reading. I'm not in as much of a hurry as it probably sounds. A fortnight, Hermione repeated, and something in her shoulders eased, the particular relief of a deadline she could actually plan around rather than a threat with no edges. All right, a fortnight, and Harry, when it happens, whatever it turns out to actually be, I want to be there, both of us. Not because we can help with the magic, I don't imagine either of us can, but because I don't think you should be alone the moment you stop being only yourself. Ron nodded once, firm, no jokes in it this time. What she said. Harry looked between them and thought, not for the first time that autumn, that whatever else this war eventually cost him, it had not yet managed to cost him this. 2 people who kept showing up at the exact moment showing up mattered most. He didn't say that aloud either. He simply nodded once and let the promise stand where it was, unspoken and entirely understood, the way the truest promises between the 3 of them always had been. Chapter 3. End. Chapter 4. The Master of Death. The fortnight Hermione had asked for stretched, in practice, to nearly 3 weeks because she refused to call the research finished until she had exhausted every avenue that existed and invented 2 more to be thorough, and Harry let her, because her thoroughness was its own kind of love and he'd stopped, somewhere in October, being the sort of person who resented being loved carefully. He spent those weeks learning the cloak properly, the way he promised he would. He'd worn it 100 times over 5 years and never once, he realized now, actually understood it, the way you can wear a coat for a decade, without ever learning the particular weight of the fabric across your shoulders. He sat with it in the evenings, in the circular chamber the castle kept giving him, and did what he'd done with the Elder Wand and the stone before it. Not use it, not yet, just hold it, feel its edges, learn the specific quality of the silence it made around him when he drew it over his shoulders, and the world's noise dropped away by half without a single sound actually muffled. It never dimmed. 5 years of use, curses glancing past it, mud and blood and basilisk venom, and the general wreckage of a childhood spent surviving things that shouldn't have been survivable, and the fabric remained exactly as his father had left it, silver gray and perfect, cool to the touch in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. He understood, holding it in the firelight on the 14th night, why the third brother had chosen it over the other 2 gifts, and why the tale called it the wisest choice rather than merely the safest. The wand offered power that could be taken from you by anyone bold enough to try. The stone offered a truth that could break you from the inside if you weren't ready to hold it. The cloak offered nothing you could lose to another hand, and nothing you could be undone by from within. It only asked you to accept that some part of you would always, from that point forward, be a little bit unseen, even by the people who loved you, even, sometimes, by yourself. He thought that was probably the most honest metaphor for what he'd already become that autumn, and didn't examine the thought too closely because some thoughts were more useful left slightly out of focus. He practiced with it too, in ways he hadn't bothered to as a younger boy, simply grateful for a means of avoiding filch. He learned the specific silence it granted, distinct from an ordinary muffliato, a silence that seemed to fold sound away rather than simply blocking it, and he learned that the cloak, unlike the other 2 Hallows, asked nothing of him in return for its use. No test, no toll, no flicker of temptation waiting at its edges. It simply worked, patiently, exactly as it had for 5 years, and Harry understood, the more he sat with it, that this was itself the lesson the tale had buried inside its simplest gift. Some kinds of power cost nothing precisely because they demand nothing of your character to wield safely. The cloak would never ask him who he wanted to become. It only asked him to accept that he'd sometimes have to go unseen to get there. He read, during those same weeks, everything Hermione handed him about wand lore, necromancy, and the handful of documented near attempts at Hallows-adjacent magic across 4 centuries of increasingly desperate and uniformly unsuccessful wizarding history, and found, at the bottom of all of it, the same conclusion repeated in a dozen different scholarly voices. Nobody had ever tried what he was about to try, not because it was impossible. Every recorded attempt had foundered on exactly that asymmetry. A hunger for power that outpaced a hunger for truth, or a hunger for truth that outpaced a patience for concealment. Or, more often, simple greed dressed up as balance and unable to survive contact with an actual test of it. He understood, finishing the last of Hermione's notes on the 16th night, that the reason the Master of Death was a figure out of a children's story rather than a documented historical office was not that the magic was too difficult. It was that the character required to survive it was too rare. They chose Godric's Hollow in the end because Harry couldn't think of anywhere else that made the same kind of sense once he let himself consider it properly. Hermione had found the reference 3 days into her research and brought it to him with a particular suppressed excitement she reserved for a fact that changed everything. The Potter family grave in the village churchyard bore, carved beneath his parents' names, a line from scripture that had nothing to do with scripture at all once you knew what you were looking at. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. And beside it, weathered nearly smooth by decades of rain, a symbol Harry now recognized on sight. A triangle traced around a circle traced around a vertical line. The same mark that had sat unremarked in the corner of the Tales of Beedle the Bard for 200 years before Sirius had ever owned it, the same mark Hermione's cross-referencing had confirmed, that had once served as the Peverell family's own device. Your father's family put it there on purpose, Hermione told him, in the library, quiet with the specific gravity of someone handing over something they knew mattered more than they could fully articulate, or someone who knew the truth of your lineage did, generations back, and had simply been sitting there ever since, in plain sight, waiting for someone who understood what they were looking at. Harry had gone to see it once already, at 14, and a dream that turned out to be a memory of Voldemort's making, and had not been back since in any waking sense, though he'd thought about the village more times than he could count. It felt right, in a way he couldn't have argued for logically and didn't try to. He'd end this particular hunt at the beginning of everything that had made the hunt necessary in the first place. He asked Dumbledore to come this time, not to help, to witness. The old man accepted with a gravity that suggested he understood the difference and asked in turn whether Harry wanted Ron and Hermione there as well, and Harry said yes before the question had fully finished being asked, because some promises were worth honoring before anyone had to remind him he'd made them. He asked Ginny too in the end, though it took him 2 full days to work up the nerve, uncertain whether the asking crossed some line he hadn't yet mapped between the people who fought beside him and the people he was still, cautiously, learning to want beside him for reasons that had nothing to do with the war at all. She'd said yes without hesitation, and then, seeing something in his face, added gently that she understood if tonight wasn't the night for anything except exactly what it needed to be, and he'd been grateful, in a way he didn't fully have words for yet, that she'd thought to say it plainly rather than let him spend the walk to the village wondering. They apparated to the village outskirts on a cold, clear evening in early December, snow already collecting in the hedgerows, the light going the particular deep blue it goes in the hour before true dark. The village itself was unremarkable in the way Harry had somehow always known it would be. Cottages with smoke rising straight up from their chimneys in the windless cold, a war memorial in the square that Harry didn't look at too closely because he suspected, correctly, that it would show him something he wasn't ready to see yet. Hermione's hand found his once, briefly, on the walk to the churchyard, and he let it stay there a moment before he needed both hands free. They passed the cottage first, on the way to the church, because the lane to the churchyard ran directly by it and there was no way to reach one without walking past the other. Harry had known, distantly, that it still stood, or half stood, a ruin the village had never quite managed to either restore or tear down, ivy climbing through a collapsed upper floor where a nursery had once been, a plaque nailed to the remaining garden wall by grateful strangers he'd never meet, thanking a woman he couldn't remember for a sacrifice he'd spent his whole life failing to properly repay. He stopped in front of it for exactly as long as he could bear to, no longer, and then made himself keep walking because he'd promised himself, planning this evening, that he would not let grief choose the hour. He had an appointment to keep, and grief, he'd learned over an autumn of careful practice, could walk alongside him without being allowed to steer. The grave was exactly as Hermione had described it. Granite gone soft-edge with weather. His parents' names cut deep enough to have survived 16 winters, the old Peverell mark beneath the scripture line catching the last gray light in a way that made it look, for a moment, less like carved stone and more like something waiting. Harry stood in front of it for a long time before he did anything else. Ron and Hermione stood a little behind him, close enough to matter and far enough to give him room. Ginny beside them with her arms wrapped against the cold and her eyes steady on him rather than the grave. And Dumbledore stood further back still, near the churchyard gate, a tall, dark shape against the deepening blue. Present the way a witness is present rather than the way a participant is. I don't really know how to start, Harry admitted, to no one in particular, his breath fogging in the cold. You already know, Dumbledore said. From the gate, his voice carrying easily across the still air, you have known since a book fell open in a dead man's room. You do not start this the way you start a spell. You started the way you start a decision. You simply stopped deciding not to. Harry took the Elder Wand from inside his coat, warm despite the cold the moment his hand closed around it, the way it always was now. Patient and familiar, he took the Resurrection Stone from his pocket, small and black and unremarkable in the failing light. He drew the cloak from his bag and settled it over his shoulders, feeling the world's noise drop away by half the instant the fabric closed over him, and stood, at the foot of his parents' grave, holding all three at once for the first time since he'd first understood what they were. Nothing happened. For one long suspended moment, except an ordinary December evening continuing to be exactly what it had been a minute before. Snow. Cold. The distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the village. Harry felt a flicker of something that might have been doubt, and set it aside, because doubt, he'd learned, was not the same thing as being wrong, only the same thing as being human, and he intended to remain both. Then he closed his eyes and did the thing the story had never actually described in words, because it wasn't a spell with an incantation. It was a choice, made completely, with nothing held back and nothing hedged. He accepted the wand's power without needing to prove it against anyone. He accepted the stone's truth without needing it to comfort him. He accepted the cloak's concealment without needing it to hide him from anything he wasn't willing to face directly. He held all three, deliberately, as one thing rather than three separate temptations, and understood, in the moment he finished understanding it, that this was the whole of the working. Not power seized, power reconciled. The world changed. It did not announce itself with light or thunder, though Harry would spend the rest of his life failing to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't stood there exactly what it had announced itself with instead. The cold went first, not warming but ceasing to matter, his body's report of temperature arriving from somewhere increasingly distant, as though he were receiving the sensation secondhand rather than living inside it. The churchyard's ordinary shadows, cast by headstones and the bare black branches of a yew tree at the wall's edge, began to lengthen in directions the actual light source couldn't account for, pooling and gathering toward the grave in front of him the way water gathers toward a drain, and then, quite simply, quite without ceremony, death was there. Harry understood later that he would never be able to describe accurately what he had actually seen because his eyes had not been the organ doing the seeing, not entirely. There was a shape, tall and still and patient, made of the same deepening blue as the evening sky, edges that were and were not the shadows of the yew tree, and a sense, overwhelming and entirely wordless, of vast and ancient attention, finally fully turned toward him, the way a mountain might be set to notice a single climber standing at its base. It was not cruel, it was not kind, it simply was, in a way that made every other thing Harry had ever stood in front of, Voldemort included, feel suddenly and permanently smaller by comparison. A candle held up next to something that predated fire. Harry James Potter. The voice did not arrive through his ears. It arrived the way understanding arrives, already complete, already known, and yet it had a texture to it. Harry would spend years afterward trying and failing to properly name old and dry, and threaded through with something that might, in a being so vast, have passed for genuine amusement. Here of Ignotus, grandson, many times removed, of the youngest brother, who once asked me for nothing but the means to walk his own road unwatched, and lived a very long life for his humility, and died in the end, an old man in his own bed, having outwitted me rather more thoroughly than either of his brothers managed, though he would have been embarrassed to hear it put that way. "You know who I am," Harry said, and was faintly, distantly impressed that his voice worked at all. "I know everyone," Death said eventually. "It is, I confess, the one advantage of patience over haste that even the cleverest wizards consistently underestimate. But you, Harry Potter, I have known rather longer than most, and rather more intimately, for a boy of 16 years. You have carried a piece of my old business inside your own scar since you were 15 months old. You slipped my grasp once in a nursery in this very village, wrapped in your mother's love, which is, incidentally, the only substance I have ever encountered that reliably outmaneuvers me, and I do not say that lightly. You slipped it again in a graveyard not so very different from this one. 3 years passed, when a curse should by every reasonable law have ended you ended not. And now here you stand, holding all three of the old gifts at once, the first soul to do so by full and conscious choice rather than by accident of inheritance or theft, and I find myself, Harry Potter, in the rare position of being asked a question I have not been asked in rather a long time. What question? Whether I will have you." The words settled over the churchyard with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Harry felt Ron's hand find Hermione's, somewhere behind him, heard neither of them speak, understood, distantly, that they could see something of this too, though perhaps not all of it, perhaps only the shape of the cold and the strange gathering, dark in a single still figure, at the foot of a grave holding three ordinary-looking objects that had stopped, in this particular moment, being ordinary at all. What happens if you don't? Then you keep three remarkable objects and none of what they were ever truly for. The wand remains a wand, however fine. The stone remains a stone, however strange its gift. The cloak remains a cloak. You will have gathered the ingredients and declined the recipe, and I confess I have watched wiser men than you make exactly that choice, out of fear or caution, or the entirely reasonable suspicion that anything I offer comes with a hook in it somewhere. Something that might have been a smile moved through the gathered dark, felt rather than seen. Does it? You tell me. I am not in the habit of lying, Harry Potter. It is one of the very few luxuries available to a being who has never once needed anyone's good opinion. I will tell you plainly what I am offering, and you may decide, with the same clear eyes you have used for every choice you have made since October, whether the price suits you. The presence seemed to gather itself, focus sharpening the way a held breath sharpens before speech. I do not offer immortality. Your body will age. It will tire. It will, in the fullness of time, end, as every body I have ever attended eventually does, and I will not make an exception of you merely because you have been polite to me this one evening. What I offer instead is authority. Dominion, if you prefer the grander word, though I find grand words tend to promise more than they deliver. You will hold from this night forward, standing at the boundary I keep, a measure of my own old law in your own two hands. The restless dead will know your voice and, more often than not, heed it. The threads that bind a soul into flesh, which are mine to cut and no one else's, however loudly certain desperate men insist otherwise, will answer to your asking within limits I intend to set myself, and you will not enjoy testing. And you will see, Harry, with a clarity no living eye has been permitted before you, exactly how thin the veil between your world and mine has always actually been. That clarity is not comfortable. I want you to understand that before you accept it. Most men spend their whole lives arranging elaborate furniture around the fact of me, so they need not look at it directly. You are asking me to take the furniture away. What can I do with it? Harry asked. You've told me what you're offering. Tell me the edges of it too. I've learned this year that the shape of a gift matters less than the shape of its limits. A fair asking and better put than most who have stood where you stand ever thought to put it. The dark seemed almost to settle, the way a teacher settles into a subject long practiced. You will not raise the truly dead to walk again in flesh, whole and warm and unchanged as if death had never touched them. That door does not open from your side or from mine, not for love, not for grief, not for any price you could offer. Because a soul once fully departed has gone somewhere even I do not fully command. Only ushered toward, you will not be free from your own dying. Only its steward rather than its subject, which is a considerably smaller mercy than the stories tend to promise, and a considerably larger one than any wizard before you has ever actually been granted. You will not be able to compel a soul to remain bound past its natural hour merely because you wish it, or because someone living wishes it on that soul's behalf, however desperately. That particular cruelty belongs to men like Voldemort, who tear and bind and call it strength. It will never belong to you, not while you hold my authority honestly, because the moment you used it that way, you would no longer be holding it. You would simply be him, with better manners. And the ring. Harry glanced down at the stone, small and black in his palm. What does it actually do now that I understand what you're offering? The old story says it calls the dead back. You're telling me that's not really what happens? It never was. Not truly. Something in the dark shifted, gentler now, almost patient in a different register. What it calls is not the dead themselves, whole and returned, but a true and faithful shade of them, drawn from what your own memory and my own record hold in common, close enough to converse with, close enough to grieve properly rather than merely miss, is not a resurrection. It was never a resurrection, whatever the second brother told himself in his desperation. It is a visitation, offered once briefly, to those with the strength to let the visitor go again afterward. I will demonstrate, if you wish it, here now, before you finish accepting the rest of what I am offering. Your mother and father are 20 feet from where you stand. I could call them to this side of the veil for the span of a few minutes, and you could speak with them, properly. Before deciding anything further at all, the offer landed in Harry's chest like a physical thing, a want so immediate and so total that for a moment he couldn't locate the ground beneath his own feet. He thought of his mother's voice, which he had never once heard except as a scream in the presence of Dementors. He thought of his father's face, which he knew only from photographs and a single borrowed memory in a pensive years before. He could have them, right now, real enough to speak to, real enough to ask the 1,000 questions he'd never once been able to ask anyone who'd actually known them as more than a legend. He thought in the same breath of the second brother's bride, cold and sad and not truly returned, and of what it would do to him, afterward, to have held them and lost them a second time, freshly. Deliberately, on a December evening with his friends and his old headmaster watching, he thought of the fortnight he'd spent learning to want things on his own terms rather than grief's terms, and understood that this test had probably always been the true center of everything the tale had been trying to teach, dressed up in a story about brothers so that nobody would notice how personal the actual lesson was. "No," Harry said, and it cost him more than anything he'd said that evening to say it. "Not like this. Not as a test I pass by proving I can bear to see them and let them go again. If I ever call them, it'll be because I've earned the right to grieve properly with them. Not because I needed to prove something to you, or to myself, in the middle of accepting the rest of this." His voice held, barely, on the last of it. "Keep the offer. I might need it again someday, honestly, for the right reasons. Tonight isn't that day." The dark was quiet a long moment, and when Death spoke again, the ancient amusement in the voice had deepened into something that might, in a being so vast, have been the closest thing to genuine approval Harry would ever hear from it. "Good," Death said simply. "That is, very precisely, the correct answer, and I confess I did not expect it delivered so cleanly on the first asking. Your ancestor took considerably longer to arrive at the same restraint, and he had the advantage of not being offered the test quite so directly." Harry stood a long moment in the gathering cold that wasn't cold, turning the rest of the offer over, aware of his own heartbeat as a fact reported to him from a slight distance, aware of Ron and Hermione standing close behind him, aware of Dumbledore, further back, utterly silent, watching a working he had spent 60 years too afraid to attempt himself. "What do you get out of it?" Harry asked. "You're old. You said it yourself. You don't need anyone's good opinion. Why offer this at all?" The dark seemed to consider the question with what felt, unmistakably, like respect, because you asked the right question at the right time, which is rarer than you would think, and because I am, in my own fashion, tired of being fought by men who cannot win, and courted by men who should never be trusted with the answer. Voldemort has spent years building crude, ugly little fortresses against me out of murder, tearing his own soul into pieces to avoid an appointment he has never once had the courage to keep honestly. He is not the first. He will not be the last. But I find, across the whole long span of my acquaintance with your species, that I have a particular fondness for the rare soul who comes to me neither begging nor fleeing, and asks, instead, plainly, what the actual terms are. A pause, vast and patient. Your ancestor was the last man to ask me that question honestly. I have been waiting a very long time for someone worth answering it again. Harry thought of Voldemort's soul in 7 unnatural pieces, tethered to the world by objects and cruelty and a refusal so total it had cost him his own face. He thought of Dumbledore, 60 years carrying a wand he'd never dared to properly wield, and a grief he'd never let himself finish grieving. He thought of the third brother, greeting death as an old friend at the very end of a long, deliberately chosen life, going with him gladly, as equals. "I accept," Harry said, "on my own terms, not to escape you, not to rule you, to hold what you're offering the way it's meant to be held, and to decide, myself, when and how I finish." "Then it is done," Death said, "and it was always going to be done the moment you finished that sentence rather than the moment you started it. That is the whole of the secret, Harry Potter, that better and worse men than you have spent centuries failing to learn. Not the words, the completeness behind them." The authority did not arrive like a spell being cast. It arrived like a held breath finally, fully released, and Harry felt in the space of a single heartbeat, the entire churchyard rearrange itself around a new fact about him that hadn't existed 30 seconds before. He felt the dead in the ground beneath his feet, not as a horror, not as anything close to the cheap Gothic imagery he might once have expected, but as a fact of presence, patient and ordinary, the way you feel a house is occupied before anyone speaks. He felt the specific shape of his parents' rest, 20 feet away, undisturbed, unbothered by his new understanding of them, exactly as at peace as they had been the moment before he'd learned to perceive it. He felt, distantly, impossibly, the entire village's worth of buried dead. And past them, in a scale that made his knees genuinely threaten to give out beneath him, some vast and terrible sense of every boundary between living and not living, everywhere all at once, thin as paper and entirely absolutely his to perceive. It kept widening. He falting for a fraction of a second that stretched itself into something closer to an hour by every internal measure he had, the whole of Britain's dead at once, moorland cairns and city cemeteries and forgotten battlefield pits, a chorus of stillness so vast it had no right to be called silence, and past that, further, a sense of the sea and what the sea had swallowed across centuries of storms and wars and ordinary, unremarked drownings, and further still, a horizon he had no language for at all, curving away into he understood, with a clarity that arrived whether he wanted it or not, exactly how small a war against one dark wizard actually was, set against the scale of what he had just been handed authority over, and the understanding very nearly took his legs out from under him entirely. It was too much. He understood, in the same instant he felt it, that it was designed to be too much. That this was the test folded invisibly into the gift, the same test that had killed the first brother's pride and the second brother's reason. whether he would let the scale of it consume the specific, small, human shape of who he actually was. He reached, instinctively, for something to hold on to that wasn't cosmic. He found Ron's hand on his shoulder, gripping hard, grounding, entirely unaware of the scale of what it was anchoring. He found Hermione's voice saying his name once quietly, not a question, just a fact, offered into the dark to remind him it existed. He found, absurdly, gratefully, the memory of Ron's joke in the library corridor a month before. Save me a seat, small and stupid, and entirely, perfectly human, and he held on to it the way you'd hold a rope in open water, and the vastness receded, not gone, never entirely gone again, but sorted, finally, into something he could carry, rather than something that carried him. He opened his eyes. The churchyard was ordinary again, snow and headstones, and the deep blue edge of true dark finally arriving over the rooftops. Death was gone, or had never been visible in any way that persisted, and yet Harry understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with sight, that gone was the wrong word entirely. Death did not leave the way a person leaves a room. Death simply stopped, for the moment, being the thing Harry was looking at directly, the way you stop looking directly at the sun, without the sun ceasing to exist. Ron was staring at him, hand still gripping his shoulder, face pale in the near dark. "Your eyes went silver," he said, hoarse. "For about 10 seconds. Proper silver, like the moon was inside them." "They're not anymore." "No. Green again. Just." Ron swallowed, visibly rattled in a way Harry had rarely seen from him. "Bloody hell, Harry." Hermione hadn't spoken at all. She was looking at him with an expression Harry had never seen on her face before. Not fear exactly, something closer to the specific awe of a person watching a law of the universe demonstrate itself in front of her for the first time, tempered by the fierce, unwavering fact of still being, underneath the awe, entirely on his side. "You're still you," she said finally, quietly. And Harry understood it wasn't a question either. It was a verification, spoken aloud so everyone standing close enough to hear could have it confirmed. "I'm still me," he agreed, and found, testing the words against how he actually felt, that they were true. Ginny hadn't moved from where she stood, arms still wrapped against the cold, watching him with an expression that held none of Ron's alarm, and none of Hermione's careful cataloging either, something steadier and more private than either. "I believe you," she said simply when he met her eyes. "I've watched you go somewhere and come back all year. This is just the furthest you've gone yet. Doesn't change what I see when you land." Something in her plainness settled him more than either of the others' reactions had, and he held her gaze a moment longer than the exchange strictly required, grateful in a way he didn't yet have full words for, that she'd chosen to meet the moment with steadiness rather than fear. Dumbledore approached last, slowly, across the churchyard, his face unreadable in the gathering dark. He stopped a few feet away and looked at Harry for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he has spent 60 years imagining and has finally, at the very end of his own long involvement with it, been permitted to actually witness. "Well," he said, finally, echoing his own words from a room of requirement a month before, though his voice carried none of that morning's rueful humor now. "I believe, Harry, that I have just watched something happen that I once dreamed of causing myself at 17 in a garden not unlike this one, for reasons considerably less worthy than yours. I find I'm glad, in the end, that it was you rather than me. I do not believe I would have survived it with as much of myself intact." "I don't know how much of myself is intact," Harry admitted, and it was the first entirely honest thing he'd said since the presence had faded. "I know I'm still standing here. I know I still recognize you and them and myself mostly. I don't know yet what the rest of it's actually going to cost." "No," Dumbledore agreed. "Neither, I suspect, will you know fully for some time yet. That is, I am afraid, rather the nature of costs of this magnitude. They do not present themselves all at once, conveniently itemized. They arrive in installments, across years, and you learn to recognize them only in retrospect, generally at moments you did not choose." He looked toward the grave, toward the old Peverell Mart catching a last scrap of light before full dark took the churchyard entirely. "But you are still you, Harry. I heard your friends say it, and I have watched you closely enough this evening to believe it myself. That is not nothing. That may, in fact, be the whole of what will keep you from becoming anything the rest of us would need to fear." "What happens now?" Harry asked. "Practically, I don't imagine there's a handbook for this." "There is not, though I suspect you and Miss Granger will have written the better part of one before the year is out of sheer stubborn necessity." A ghost of the old warmth returned to Dumbledore's face, brief but genuine. "Practically, I expect the world will feel this before it understands what it has felt. Magic of this order does not stay contained to a single churchyard on a single December evening. Wards will register disturbances they cannot explain. Creatures that live close to the boundary I imagine you now partly hold, Dementors, certain ghosts, the older and stranger things that keep to the Forbidden Forest's deepest parts, will sense a shift in the balance of things and behave unpredictably until they adjust to it, or until you teach them what you intend to be to them. And Voldemort, who has spent 6 years building elaborate defenses against exactly the authority you now carry, will notice, sooner rather than later, that something has fundamentally changed in the shape of the war he believes himself to be winning. Will he know what it is? Not immediately. He is brilliant and paranoid and utterly convinced of his own singular understanding of death, which is, I suspect, about to become his greatest weakness rather than his greatest strength. He will search for weeks, perhaps months, for a mundane explanation, because the alternative, that a 16-year-old boy has succeeded at the one working he himself never dared attempt, will be, for him, close to unthinkable. Dumbledore's eyes held something sharp and old beneath their tiredness. That gives you time, Harry. Not unlimited time, but time enough to decide, deliberately, how you intend to use what you now hold before the war forces your hand rather than the reverse. I would encourage you to spend it wisely. You have earned, this evening, the right to choose your own pace for once, and I would hate to see that particular victory wasted on haste. They stood a while longer, in the deepening cold, 5 figures at the edge of a churchyard that looked, to any passing muggle, like nothing more than a small group visiting a grave on a winter evening, and Harry understood, looking down at his parents' names one last time before they turned to leave, that something had ended here, and something else, vast and unfamiliar and entirely his own to shape, had begun in its place, out past the borders of anything the old story had ever quite prepared him to expect. The walk back to the apparition point took them past the cottage a second time, and Harry found, this time, that he could look at it a little longer than before. Not because the grief had lessened, but because he understood it differently now, some fundamental terror gone out of it that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying until its absence made itself known. His parents were not lost to some incomprehensible void beyond his reach. They were held patiently by something vast and orderly and, in its own ancient fashion, capable of courtesy. That understanding didn't undo a single day of missing them. It simply changed the texture of the missing, from a wound with no bottom, to a distance he could, at least in theory, someday choose to close on his own terms rather than have closed for him by an accident or a curse. Ron walked beside him in silence for most of the way, hands jammed in his pockets against the cold, and broke it only once, near the village edge, with the particular bluntness that made him, Harry had long since decided, one of the most reliably honest people he knew. "I'm not going to pretend I understood most of what just happened back there," Ron said. "But I saw your eyes go silver, and I heard something talk to you out of the dark that made my teeth hurt just standing near it, and you're still cracking on about ripples like it's an ordinary Tuesday, and I think that's either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the maddest, and I haven't fully decided which." He glanced sideways, something steady beneath the words. "Either way. Still here, mate. Thought you should know that plainly, in case tonight made you wonder." "I didn't wonder," Harry said, and meant it. Hermione had gone quiet in a different way, thoughtful rather than shaken. Already Harry suspected, cataloging questions she intended to spend the coming weeks trying to answer properly. She caught his sleeve gently as they reached the apparition point, holding him back half a step from Ron and Dumbledore. "For what it's worth," she said, low, just for him. "I don't think you needed my fortnight of research half as much as I needed to spend a fortnight convincing myself you were ready. You were ready before I finished the first book." Something in her face eased, tired but entirely genuine. "I'm glad I got to see it anyway. Whatever it turns out to mean." "Me too," Harry said, and found, turning the words over, that he meant that as well, more completely than he'd expected to mean anything that strange cold evening. "Ripples," he said aloud, not quite to anyone, testing the word the way he'd once tested Master of Death alone in a firelit room. "I beg your pardon?" Hermione asked. "Nothing." He drew his own wand from his pocket, ordinary and warm and entirely familiar, and gave the elder wand a final, private glance before tucking it away beside it. "Just a feeling that this isn't going to stay quiet for very long." He was right, though he wouldn't understand exactly how right for nearly another month. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. Ripples. The first sign arrived on the 4th day, and Harry very nearly missed it entirely because it announced itself not as anything dramatic but as a small, persistent wrongness at the edge of a defense against the dark arts lesson that everyone else in the room seemed to experience as nothing more than an unusually chilly draft. They were practicing Patronuses, a review exercise the year's defense replacement, a competent but unremarkable witch named Hestia Cabe had scheduled for the week before the holidays, and Harry raised his wand along with the rest of the class, thought of Ron's joke in the library corridor because it was still, 6 weeks later, the thought that worked best, and said the incantation. The stag that erupted from his wand tip was not the stag he'd been producing since 4th year. It was larger, for one thing, silver light pouring off it in a way that made 3 nearby students flinch back from their desks, and it moved through the room, not with an animal's grace, but with something closer to processional weight, the way a king might be said to move through a hall rather than the way a deer moves through a forest. It circled the room once, and where its light touched the ambient chill that had settled over the classroom sometime in the last 10 minutes, without anyone noticing, the cold simply stopped all at once, as though the stag's presence had reminded the room what temperature it was actually supposed to be. Several students actually applauded, delighted, assuming it was a particularly impressive display rather than anything strange. Hermione did not applaud. She was staring at the stag with an expression Harry recognized from the churchyard, the specific attention of someone doing careful, urgent maths behind her eyes. That wasn't a Patronus, she told him afterward, in the corridor, low and fast. Or it was, but it was something else layered underneath it. Harry, I think Dementors are going to be a very different problem for you from now on. She was right, though it took him another 3 days to understand exactly how right. He found a Dementor on the 5th day, patrolling the ground's perimeter as part of the Ministry's continuing, largely useless security presence, and felt it before he saw it. A wrongness in the air that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with a kind of magical static, an interference pattern he'd never once registered before December, and now couldn't stop registering. The Dementor, for its part, did something he'd never seen a Dementor do in 5 years of dreading them. It stopped, mid-glide, 40 feet from where he stood, and did not come any closer. It hovered there, hood turned toward him, and Harry understood, with the same wordless certainty that had told him when the ring was ready to be pierced, that the creature was not hunting him. It was waiting to see what he wanted from it. He didn't test the boundaries of that. Not yet. He simply turned and walked back toward the castle and felt the Dementor's attention track him the entire way. Patient, deferential, entirely unlike anything a Dementor had ever been in his experience of them. He went back 2 days later, deliberately, because he'd decided that avoiding the question wasn't the same as answering it, and he needed to know what he was actually dealing with before it mattered in a fight. He found the same creature, or one indistinguishable from it, gliding at slow patrol along the boundary wall in the blue dusk, and this time he walked toward it rather than away. Feeling the old familiar cold reach for him and simply declined to take hold, the way it never once had in 5 years of dreading exactly this creature. "You don't get to feed on people anymore. Not without my say," he said it quietly. Not a threat exactly. More a statement of fact being entered into a record neither of them could see. "I don't know yet what I intend to do with you, or with the rest of your kind. I haven't decided. But I want you to understand, before I do decide, that the decision is mine to make now, and I intend to make it carefully, not out of hatred, whatever you've earned from me over the years." The Dementor's hood turned fractionally, an unreadable gesture that might, in a creature with a face, have been a bow. It didn't speak. Dementors never spoke, not in any language Harry had access to. But something in its stillness afterward felt different from the stillness of fear, closer, if such a thing were possible for something so fundamentally alien, to a kind of relief. He walked back to the castle, turning the encounter over, and understood, with a particular clarity that had become ordinary to him over the autumn, that the war was going to hand him choices no one before him had ever had to make, and that he had best get comfortable making them deliberately, because the alternative was making them by accident, under pressure, in the heat of whatever came next. The awareness itself arrived more gradually and cost him more sleep than he told anyone about at first, even Ron and Hermione. It began as a background hum he could mostly ignore, a sense, distant and constant, of the ordinary rhythm of dying happening everywhere. All the time, the way you might become aware of your own heartbeat if someone pointed it out and then never quite stop hearing it again. An old man's heart stopping in a cottage in Devon. A first frost, claiming something small and wild in the forbidden forest. The particular gentle unwinding of someone very old and very tired somewhere in some goes, surrounded by family, entirely at peace. Most of it was quiet. Most of it, he came to understand within the first week, was not tragedy at all. Simply the ordinary machinery of a world that had always been dying constantly and had simply, before December, done so outside the range of anything he could perceive. He learned, slowly and with real effort, to let it move through him the way he learned to let grief move through him without steering by it. Background rather than command. Texture rather than crisis. It was, he suspected, the first genuine installment of the cost Dumbledore had warned him about in the churchyard, arriving exactly the way the old man had said it would. Not all at once, conveniently itemized, but in a low, constant hum he had to learn to carry without letting it carry him instead. What he could not learn to ignore, no matter how much practice he gave it, was the other kind, the wrong kind. A death approaching by violence rather than by time, which arrived in his awareness with a completely different texture, sharp, where the ordinary hum was soft, urgent where the background was patient, a splinter of wrongness that demanded attention the way a burn demands attention. He felt his first one on the 9th day, sitting in the library over a Transfiguration essay he never finished, a spike of it arriving from somewhere south and west of the castle, distant but unmistakable, someone somewhere about to be murdered. He was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to stand. He didn't stop to think about permission or protocol or the fact that he was still, technically, a 6th-year student with a curfew. He pulled the cloak over his shoulders on the way out of the library, felt the world's noise fold away by half, and was down the marble staircase and out past the front doors before Madame Pence had finished looking up from her desk to ask where the noise had come from. The ground's apparition wards didn't extend to students. Not officially, but Harry had stopped, sometime in November, being the kind of wizard those particular wards were designed to stop, and he crossed the boundary at a dead run and turned on the spot the instant he cleared it, letting the sharp, violent pull of the death sense guide the apparition itself. An act of navigation he'd never attempted before and didn't have time to doubt. He arrived in the wreckage of a garden and a village he didn't recognize. Cold night air. The smell of scorched wood and something worse underneath it. And understood, standing there with his own breath fogging white in front of him. that he'd arrived 4 minutes too late. The cottage in front of him had a hole where its front door should have been, curtains still smoldering at one window, and the specific, terrible silence of a place that had very recently stopped containing the people who used to fill it. He didn't go inside straight away. He stood in the garden a moment, letting the death sense settle from a scream into a residue, and felt, underneath the fresh horror of it, the retreating signature of 4 wands, moving fast, northwest, already a mile off and gaining distance. He followed on foot at first, then at a dead sprint once the hedgerows gave way to open field, tracking a trail no ordinary wizard could have followed at all. Not by footprint or scent, but by the specific, ugly texture 4 recent killers left smeared across the ambient magic of the night like fingerprints on glass. He found the safe house 20 minutes later, a squat, unremarkable farm building at the edge of a copse of bare trees, wards thrown up in haste and confidence by men who had never once, in 6 years of terrorizing Muggle-born families, needed to consider that something might actually be hunting them back. He didn't knock. He didn't need to. The cloak took him through their outer wards the way it had always taken him through wards built to catch ordinary intruders, and he found all 4 of them inside, boots still muddy, one of them laughing at something the others had apparently found very funny only moments before. And Harry stood in the doorway a long silent moment, letting them notice him one at a time, watching each man's face travel the same short distance from confusion to a fear more total than anything he ever seen grown in front of him before. He threw off the cloak deliberately, wanting to be seen clearly, wanting no ambiguity afterward about who had done what was about to be done. "You have a choice," he said into the sudden ringing silence of 4 wands, scrabbling for a fight that had already, though none of them understood it yet, been decided before he'd walked through the door. "You can raise those wands, in which case, I promise you, this ends the way every duel with me has ended since October. Or you can put them on the table, slowly, and listen to what I actually came here to offer, which is considerably more mercy than you extended to the family whose house is currently burning half a mile from here." 2 of them went for their wands anyway, which told Harry everything he needed to know about how much 6 years under Voldemort had taught them to fear anything more than hesitation. He disarmed both before either curse fully formed, the Elder Wand answering with the same patient, total certainty it always did now, no effort in it at all. And the remaining 2 put their wands on the table without needing to be asked twice. "The working I am about to perform on all 4 of you has a name I am not going to give you, because I do not think you have earned the comfort of knowing what to call your own ending," Harry said, and heard his own voice come out flat, controlled, entirely unlike the uncertain 16-year-old who had once needed Sirius's memory to steady his hand before a duel. "It will not kill you. It will take, permanently, the one thing that let you walk into that house tonight and do what you did to people who never raised a wand against you. You will live the rest of your lives as what you would have called 6 years ago, before Voldemort gave you a uniform to hide behind, ordinary men. I find that considerably more just than killing you, though I want you to understand it was a choice, not a mercy that came naturally. And I want you to remember, every single day for the rest of your ordinary lives, exactly whose choice it was. None of them fought it in the end. Whatever they'd expected walking into that farmhouse that night, it hadn't been this, and fear, Harry was learning, made men extraordinarily compliant in exactly the moments compliance cost them the most. He told Dumbledore that evening, and the old man listened with a particular stillness he reserved for information that changed the shape of a plan already in motion. Before Harry could begin, Dumbledore offered news of his own, delivered with the same careful weight he now gave everything he chose to share rather than withhold. "Creature came to me this week," he said, with an object he had been guarding, unasked, since a young man named Regulus Black died trying to steal it from a cave full of inferi some years before you were born. A locket, Harry, matching the description in every particular. I destroyed it myself 3 days past with considerably less ceremony than your working in the Gaunt Shack, though I confess it cost my nerves rather more than I let Creature see. He inclined his head, a small acknowledgement of a debt paid. One fewer piece of him in the world. I thought you would want to know before we continue. Harry absorbed that, adding it silently to the running count he'd started keeping, without quite meaning to, alongside the ring and the diary already crossed off, and nodded once before turning to his own news. You felt it happening, Dumbledore prompted, when Harry didn't immediately continue. Not merely the fact of death in general, which I confess I expected you to eventually perceive in some form. A specific, violent death in progress at a distance. Yes. It felt different, sharper. Harry paced the length of the office once, twice, restless in a way he hadn't been since October. I couldn't get there in time. I tried, I apparated as close as the wards would let me, but by the time I reached the address I'd felt, it was already over. A family. Muggle-born, I think, from what was left to tell. Death Eaters, 4 of them, gone by the time I arrived. He stopped pacing. I felt it stop, sir. The dying. I felt it exact moment it finished happening, from over a mile away, before I ever saw the house. And what did you do? I found the trail. It wasn't hard, not with what I can feel now. I tracked them to a safe house 40 minutes later. He met Dumbledore's eyes, steady despite what he was about to describe. I could have killed all 4 of them. I want you to know that plainly because I think it matters that you hear me say it rather than assume it. I had every tactical advantage, every legal and moral justification anyone could ask for, and for about 10 seconds, standing outside that door, I wanted to more than I've wanted anything since Sirius fell. He paused. I didn't. What did you do instead? I took their wands, all 4, not with Expelliarmus either. I didn't want them getting new ones and simply starting over somewhere else next week. Something colder moved into his voice, the register he'd been building since October without entirely admitting to himself he was building it. There's a working, the same family of magic as the Wand Allegiance business. Older, uglier, that severs a caster from magic itself if the caster's own hand is guided to do it under specific compulsion. I made all 4 of them do it themselves, aware, understanding exactly what they were surrendering and why, before I let them go. They're alive. They're in ministry custody by now, I imagine, since I left them tied for whoever found them first. They will never cast a hostile spell again as long as they live because they no longer have magic to cast one with. He held Dumbledore's gaze and did not look away from what he saw there. I know how that sounds. I thought about it a long time before I did it, and I'd do it again tomorrow if the choice came up the same way. Killing them would have been faster and, in a strange way, kinder. I chose the crueler mercy on purpose because I wanted every Death Eater who hears about it to understand that I'm not simply another duelist who might get lucky against them. I'm something they can't outplan, and I want that understood before more families end up like the one I felt dying tonight. Dumbledore was quiet a long moment, and Harry watched him weigh it, genuinely weigh it, rather than react from either approval or alarm. That is not mercy, Dumbledore said finally. Not entirely. I want you to hear me say that plainly in return, because I think it matters that you hear it from someone willing to say it, rather than simply nod along with whatever you've decided is justified. That is a punishment, dressed in mercy's clothing and dressed carefully, because you are clever enough to know the difference and have chosen the dressing anyway, for the deterrent effect. I do not say this to condemn you. I am not certain, this evening, that I disagree with the choice. But I would not have you deceive yourself about what you did. Call it what it is, even in the privacy of your own head, or you will find in a year or 5 that the dressing has become indistinguishable from the thing it was covering, and you will have stopped being able to tell the difference yourself. Harry sat with that a long moment and found, honestly examining it, that he couldn't argue with a single word of it. All right, he said. It was a punishment. A calculated one. I'm not going to pretend otherwise to you or to myself. He looked up. Does that change whether you think I should have done it? No, Dumbledore said. It changes only whether you understand what you have actually become willing to do, which is, I think, considerably more important than whether I approve. I am 60 years older than you and have made worse choices than this one for reasons I believed at the time were unimpeachable. I am not in a strong position to judge you for choosing precision over compassion in a single hard hour. I ask only that you keep choosing it deliberately, with your eyes open, rather than let it become a reflex you no longer examine. Word traveled through the Death Eater ranks within the week, exactly as Harry had intended. Though the shape it traveled in surprised even him, it reached Voldemort not as a rumor about a boy with unusual power, but as a specific, cold, tactical fact. 4 wandless men, found bound and stripped of magic outside a safe house, none of them would speak about afterward. Not out of loyalty, but because something about the experience had left them unwilling to describe it to anyone at all. Voldemort received the report in the same drawing room, the same drawn curtains, and this time he did not ask questions immediately. He sat with the information a long while, red eyes fixed on the middle distance, turning it over the way a man turns over a stone he suspects might be the edge of something much larger buried beneath it. Describe the working, he said finally, to the trembling underling who'd brought the news. Precisely. Not what it did, how it felt, according to the 4 who survived it. They say, my lord, that it felt like drowning, not in water, in absence, as though something reached into the very center of what made them wizards and simply removed it, cleanly, without anger, without cruelty even, which they found, several of them said, considerably worse than if it had been cruel. Voldemort was silent a long moment. He had built his entire war, his entire self, around the conviction that death was the only true enemy worth fearing, the only force in the universe capable of ending him that he had not already, through years of careful, monstrous preparation, rendered toothless. He had never once, in 6 years of rebuilding his power, considered that someone might be assembling an authority that operated on an entirely different axis than death at all, an authority over magic's own foundations wielded with a restraint that felt, from the outside, considerably more unsettling than rage would have. Someone new was operating in Britain, he said, to the empty room, because there was still no one in it he trusted with the full shape of his unease. Someone with power I do not yet understand, discipline I did not expect, and a taste for making examples rather than simply killing. He rose, moved to the window, looked out at nothing through the gap in the drawn curtain. I want to know who. I want to know before they finish becoming whatever they are clearly still in the process of becoming, because I have learned, across a very long life, that the most dangerous enemies are always the ones you catch while they are still unfinished. The Daily Prophet ran nothing about the safe house, officially, because the ministry's censors were still, in December, more interested in denying the war's scale than reporting its texture. But rumor moved through the wizarding world the way it always had, faster and less accountable than any newspaper, and by the second week Harry had started hearing fragments of it secondhand, at Hogsmeade weekends, in overheard conversations between older students whose families had connections to the Or office, in a letter from Neville that mentioned, almost in passing, that his gran had Gerd fout e Cleef. What get her bet? He hadn't answered that particular question directly. In his reply, though, he'd noticed, reading Neville's careful phrasing, that his friend had asked it the way you ask a question you already suspect the answer to and want confirmed gently rather than forced. Luna's letter, arriving the same week, had been more direct in the way only Luna's letters ever were. A single line, underlined twice, reading the Nargles have gone quiet near you, which Daddy says means something with real authority has started paying attention, and I think that's rather wonderful, don't you? He'd laughed out loud reading it, alone in the dormitory, the first unguarded laugh he could remember in weeks, and had written back simply, I hope so, because it was true, and because Luna, more than almost anyone, seemed to understand exactly how much truth a short sentence could carry without needing to explain itself further. The rumor had a shape by the time it finished traveling, the way rumors always did. Growing teeth and detail with every retelling, a masked figure, some said moving through the war's edges with an authority no one could name, punishing rather than merely fighting, precise in a way that felt less like heroism and more like judgment. Harry read the accumulated fragments of it with a strange, distant recognition. The way you might read a description of yourself in a language you only half spoke, close enough to be unmistakable and different enough to be unsettling. He hadn't asked to become a rumor. He understood, all the same, that a rumor was exactly the kind of weapon he needed the war to carry on his behalf while he decided, deliberately, how and when to become something more than one. He tested the rest of it carefully, over the following days, the way he'd tested every piece of this since October, alone, deliberately, in circumstances he controlled rather than circumstances that ambushed him. He found nearly headless Nick in the Great Hall one evening after most of the school had gone up to bed and asked him, plainly, whether anything had changed. Everything has changed, Nick said, with the particular gravity ghosts reserved for subjects the living rarely asked about directly. I felt it the moment you finished whatever you did in that churchyard, wherever it was. A settling, Sir Potter, is the closest word I have for it. As though a door I have lived beside for 500 years, always slightly ajar, always letting in a draft I'd long since stopped noticing, had finally, quietly, been given a keeper who might actually mind the hinges. He drifted a little closer, translucent and thoughtful. I do not fear you. If that is what you are working up to asking, I find I trust you rather more than I have trusted anyone with authority over my condition in 5 centuries of being stuck in it, which is either a great compliment or a terrible indictment of everyone who came before you, and I have not yet decided which. Would you cross over, Harry asked carefully, if I asked you to? Not forced. Asked. Nick considered the question with visible old sorrow. I have wondered, some centuries, whether I stayed out of fear or out of stubbornness, and concluded, eventually, that the distinction stopped mattering somewhere around my 200th year. I am not ready. I do not think I will ever be entirely ready, which I suspect is rather the point of ghosts in the first place. But I thank you for asking rather than simply deciding, Sir Potter. That is not a courtesy. The dead are generally shown, by the living or by anyone else. Harry let the moment settle, carrying the lesson underneath it forward without needing to name it aloud, that the authority he now carried was not a lever to be pulled whenever convenient, but a relationship, owed the same patience and consent he'd have wanted extended to himself. It felt, sitting with Nick in the empty hall, less like power and more like a kind of stewardship he hadn't fully appreciated the weight of until he'd tried, gently, to use it on someone he actually knew. Harry didn't stop at the safe house. He'd learned, over the following 2 weeks, that the same awareness that had led him there worked equally well, applied with patience, on subtler targets. Not just violence and progress, but the specific, magical signature of corruption. A wrongness with a different texture again. Colder and more bureaucratic than the sharp spike of murder, that he began to notice clustering around certain offices in the ministry itself whenever he had cause to visit. He found it most concentrated around a Wizengamot committee reviewing, with suspicious speed and suspicious leniency, a series of ministry contracts that had funneled an improbable amount of gold toward a company registered to a name Harry didn't recognize, and Hermione, after 3 days of dogged research through public filings nobody had thought to cross-reference before, eventually traced back through 2 shell purchases to Lucius Malfoy. It's not illegal exactly, Hermione told him, spreading parchment across their usual library table with the particular satisfaction of someone who had built an airtight case out of nothing but patience and public records. Or it's illegal in the specific, boring way that's very hard to prosecute quickly. Layers of ownership designed to survive exactly the kind of scrutiny that would catch anything cruder. But it's clearly Voldemort's money, laundered through ministry contracts meant for post-war reconstruction, being used to fund something Malfoy doesn't want traced back to him. Weapons, I'd guess, or bribes. Possibly both. Harry read through the documents twice, feeling the same cold, tactical clarity he'd felt outside the safe house settle over him again. Quieter this time, more patient. I'm not going after Malfoy directly, he said finally. Not yet. He's protected, connected, and killing his career over shell companies won't do anything except make Voldemort more careful about how he launders the next batch of gold. I want the committee instead. Whoever's rubber stamping this without asking questions is either being paid or being threatened, and either way, that's a door I can walk through without leaving fingerprints anywhere near the Malfoys at all. It took him 4 days to find the right member, a mid-level Wizengamot witch named Aurelia Fenwick, whose signature appeared on every relevant approval, and whose bank records, once Hermione worked out how to view them through channels that were, strictly speaking, not entirely legal for a 6th-year student to be using, showed payments arriving quarterly from an account that traced, eventually, to the same shell structure. Harry found her alone in the ministry corridor on a Thursday evening, waited until the last of her colleagues had filed past toward the lifts, and stepped out of a shadow that hadn't, until that exact moment, contained anyone at all. She startled badly, hand flying to her chest, and Harry watched her recognize him and go, if anything, more frightened rather than less, which told him everything he needed to know about how quickly rumor traveled in circles that mattered. Mrs. Immoral, Fenwick, he said, pleasant, unhurried, the elder one nowhere in sight, not needed for this particular working. I know about the contracts, I know about the gold, I know precisely which account it comes from and precisely whose interests it serves, and I am not, this evening, remotely interested in destroying your career or your family over it, because I suspect, correctly or not, that you were frightened into this rather than tempted into it. He let that sit a moment, watching her face confirm it before she managed to school her expression into anything more careful. Here are your options. You can continue signing what you've been signing, and I will make certain, quietly, that the right journalists and the right Aurors receive exactly enough evidence to end you professionally within the month, with no path back for you and considerable exposure for whoever was threatening you in the first place. Or you can start slowing the paperwork down, losing documents, requesting reviews that take months instead of days. Nothing dramatic enough to get you killed. Just enough friction to cost Voldemort's people time and money every quarter, indefinitely, in ways that will never trace back to you specifically, because half of ministry bureaucracy already moves at exactly that pace without any help at all. And if I refuse both, then I walk away and you keep doing exactly what you're doing now, and I find someone else in this building willing to be braver than you were, Harry said, and let the words land without softening them. I'm not threatening you, Mrs. Fenwick. I'm offering you the only version of this where you get to still be a person you can live with, being by the time this war ends. I'd take it if I were you. I don't think you have many more offers like this one coming. She took it. He felt, walking away down the corridor, the particular satisfaction of a plan executed cleanly, and felt, underneath it, a colder awareness he was careful not to examine too closely that night. How easily the threat had come to him, how little effort it had cost to sound exactly as dangerous as he needed to sound, and how thoroughly he had meant every word of it. He told Ron and Hermione everything, as promised, over the following weeks, and watched them absorb each new piece of it with reactions that had started, by mid-December, to settle into something steadier than the alarm of the first month. You threatened a Wizengamot official, Ron said one evening, with the air of a man checking his own understanding rather than objecting to it. In a corridor? Alone. And she just agreed. She agreed because the alternative was worse for her, and I made sure she understood that clearly, Harry said. I didn't hurt her. I'm not going to hurt her. I'm not going to hurt her unless she goes back to feeding Malfoy's people information about tonight, in which case I'll have to reconsider. And I told her that too, plainly. So there's no confusion about where the line sits. Hermione had gone quiet again, the thoughtful quiet rather than the alarmed kind, though Harry was learning to recognize a third register underneath it now, something closer to concern for him specifically rather than for the morality of what he was doing in the abstract. You're getting good at this, she said finally. Frighteningly good. I keep waiting to be uncomfortable with how easily it's coming to you, and instead I mostly just feel relieved someone competent is finally doing something about people like Malfoy, and I don't entirely trust that relief, if I'm honest. You shouldn't trust it uncritically, Harry agreed. I don't, most nights. That's rather the point of telling you both everything instead of doing it quietly and letting you find out after. I need at least 2 people in my life whose job is to tell me when the competence has started outrunning the conscience, because I don't fully trust myself to notice the gap from the inside. He looked between them, and something in his chest, familiar now, steadied at the sight of both their faces, unflinching, still there. Zoudied at the sight of both their faces, unfacing. Tell me the moment you see it, I mean that. Not gently. Plainly the way Snape does it. Deal, Hermione said, and Ron nodded, and Harry understood, watching them, that the promise mattered considerably more than either of them probably realized, because it was the one piece of architecture standing between the war he intended to win and the man Dumbledore had warned him, gently, that costs of this magnitude could eventually make of him. Ron waited until Hermione had gone up to fetch a book she'd left in the common room before he spoke again, quieter this time, without the earlier lightness. For what it's worth, he said, I don't actually think you're anywhere close to that man yet. I've watched you all year. You check yourself more than anyone I know, and you let us check you too, which I don't reckon Voldemort's ever once let anybody do in his whole life. He shrugged. awkward with the sincerity but pushing through it anyway. Just thought you should hear that plainly since Hermione's better at the worrying and I'm apparently in charge of the reassurance tonight. Thanks, Harry said, and meant it more than the single word usually carried. I needed that more than I probably let on. Yeah, well, Ron grinned, the moment's weight already lifting. Don't get used to it. I've got a reputation for tactlessness to maintain. The holidays arrived, and with them a strange, suspended quiet that Harry recognized, distantly, as the calm before something considerably larger than a corrupt Wizengamot committee. He spent Christmas at the Burrow, surrounded by Weasleys and Noise and Mrs. Burrow, Weasley's determined, overflowing kindness, and let himself, for a handful of days, simply be 16 playing Exploding Snap with Ginny until past midnight, losing spectacularly and without minding it, eating more than was strictly wise at every meal Molly put in front of him. He caught himself twice, reaching instinctively for the background hum of the world's ordinary dying and finding, for whole stretches of an afternoon, that he'd forgotten to listen for it entirely. Absorbed instead in Fred and George's latest catalog of products too dangerous for their mother to know about, or in a game of chess, Ron was thrashing him at with his usual merciless enthusiasm. He understood, noticing the gap, that this was itself a kind of victory, the ordinary noise of a family he loved crowding out, for whole contented hours, an authority most wizards would have spent every waking moment reaching for compulsively. He mentioned as much to Ginny late on Boxing Day, the two of them sitting on the backstep wrapped against the cold, watching gnomes shiver miserably in the frost-hardened garden. You look almost relaxed, she said, studying him with the same close attention she'd given him back in October. It's a good look, strange but good. I've been practicing not carrying it every second, Harry admitted. Turns out that's harder than the actual magic was. Nobody warns you the hardest part of being handed something enormous is remembering to put it down occasionally. Sounds like most things worth having, honestly. She bumped her shoulder against his, easy, unhurried, no weight in it beyond simple company. For what it's worth, I like this version. The one who can still lose at Exploding Snap and mean it. I plan on staying him, Harry said, and meant it, though some quiet, honest part of him understood, even as he said it, that meaning a thing and managing to keep it true were not always the same promise to keep. Snape found him alone on the 27th, in the lane outside the Burrows' wards, where Harry had gone to clear his head after a Weasley dinner loud enough to rattle the windows. The older man appeared without ceremony, robes dark against the snow, and delivered his report in the same register he delivered everything of consequence, flatly, without preamble, expecting Harry to keep pace rather than slowing down to accommodate him. The Dark Lord has stopped searching for Gregorovitch, Snape said. He has concluded, correctly, that the trail is cold, and has been cold for months, and has redirected his attention entirely toward the rumors circulating about your work this December. He does not yet suspect you specifically. He suspects a rival, an unknown player of considerable skill, possibly foreign, possibly a faction within the ministry he has not yet identified and bought. He is, by every account reaching me, more unsettled than I have seen him since his return 3 years ago, and an unsettled Dark Lord, Potter, is considerably more dangerous than a confident one, because unsettled men move faster and check their assumptions less. How much time do you think I have before he works it out? Less than you would like. He is not a fool, whatever else he is, and sooner or later, the pattern will point toward the one name he has spent 6 years refusing to take seriously as a genuine threat, rather than an inconvenient survivor. Snape's black eyes held his, steady, assessing. I would counsel you to decide soon whether you intend him to learn the truth on his own schedule or on yours. I have found across 2 wars that the second option tends to end considerably better for the person doing the choosing. He was gone before Harry could answer, snow settling into the space where he'd stood, and Harry walked the rest of the lane alone, turning the warning over, understanding, with the same cold clarity that had guided every choice since October, that Snape was right and that the choosing was coming whether he'd finished preparing for it or not. It didn't last and he hadn't expected it to. On the 29th of December, he woke before dawn with the sharp, violent death awareness spiking hard enough to bring him fully upright in bed, gasping, and understood, in the same instant, 2 things at once. The first was that the death in progress was close enough that the sharpness of it had a directional quality he'd never felt before, pointing him toward Ottery St. Catchpole itself, rather than somewhere distant. The second, arriving a half-second behind the first like a shadow catching up to the thing that cast it, was a second sensation entirely, one he had never felt before and understood immediately, with cold and total certainty, exactly what it meant. Somewhere close, something with a piece of Voldemort's own soul buried inside it was about to be destroyed. Voldemort had come to Ottery St. Catchpole, and he had not come alone. And he had not come, Harry understood, rising and reaching for his wand with hands that were, for the first time in months, entirely steady to talk. Chapter 5, End. Chapter 6. What the Dead Are Out. The Burrows' wards were screaming by the time Harry cleared the orchard, a high, keening pressure at the edge of his awareness that had nothing to do with the death sense and everything to do with 5 years of knowing exactly what that particular alarm meant. He'd been walking back from the village shop where he'd gone, alone, for a last-minute gift Ginny had teased him into buying, and the world had simply narrowed, in the space of a single heartbeat, from an ordinary errand into the wrongness screaming at the edge of the property, and nothing else at all. green light strobed against the low winter clouds above the house once, twice, and Harry ran the last 100 yards with his own wand already in hand, the elder wand a second, waiting weight against his ribs where he'd carried it, always now in a holster of dragon hide stitched specially for the purpose. The garden was chaos. Mr. Weasley stood in the doorway trading curses with a masked figure Harry didn't recognize. Bill and Fleur back to back near the garden wall holding off two more, and Ron, blood already darkening one sleeve, was dragging his mother bodily behind an overturned garden bench while Mrs. Bales. Weasley shouted something furious and half-finished about wanting to fight rather than hide. Past them, past the overturned table where Christmas dinner had sat only 2 days before, Harry saw Bellatrix Lestrange laughing. Delighted. Dancing between curses aimed at a Ginny who was giving considerably better than anyone had any right to expect from a 15-year-old, and beyond all of it, past the low garden hedge, coiled and patient and enormous in the trampled snow. A snake Harry recognized instantly from 3 years of nightmares. Nagini, which meant Voldemort himself was here, and Harry understood, in the same half-second he understood the snake's presence, exactly why. Snape's warning in the lane had not been paranoia. Voldemort had run out of patience for chasing rumors and had decided, with the particular ruthless efficiency Harry had learned to expect from him, to force the unknown variable into the open by attacking the people that variable, whoever it turned out to be, would be unable to ignore. Hermione arrived a bare second behind him, having apparated to the boundary the instant Harry's owl reached her, wand already drawn, and took in the whole scene with the same fast, ordering clarity she brought to every crisis. "Wards are down on the north side," she said, already moving. "I'll hold that flank. Go to Ginny. She's the one who needs you most." He didn't argue and didn't waste time on an entrance either. Some quiet, tactical instinct having learned months ago that a wasted entrance was an advantage handed away for free. He crossed the garden at a dead sprint, cloak still folded in his bag, wanting to be seen this time, wanting Bellatrix's next curse to meet a shield she hadn't accounted for, and it did. Her Cruciatus rebounding off a Prodigo thrown with enough force to knock her back 3 full steps, astonishment writing itself openly across her face before fury replaced it. "Well," she crooned, righting herself, eyes gone bright and manic in the strobing green light, "look what's come to play." Harry didn't answer her. He put himself bodily between Bellatrix and Ginny, disarmed the 2 Death Eaters pressing Bill and Fleur with 2 economical flicks of his wand that left both men staring at their empty hands in open bewilderment, and felt, distantly, the death sense flare hard and close, someone nearby balanced on the exact knife edge between living and not. He didn't have time to locate who. He had time only to fight, and he fought the way he trained since October, cold and precise and entirely without the wasted motion of rage. Bellatrix came at him herself, delighted, treating the whole exchange like sport rather than survival. Curses thrown with a wild theatrical flourish that Harry recognized, distantly, as exactly the kind of overconfidence he'd once weaponized against Dumbledore in a room of requirement 2 months before. He gave her nothing to work with. He didn't retreat, didn't shield light, didn't offer her a single opening shaped like fear, and watched her manic delight curdle, exchange by exchange, into something closer to genuine unease as curse after curse met a defense that never once looked rushed. "You gotten good, little Potter," she crooned, circling wand hand twitching with barely restrained hunger. "Shame I'll have to fix that." "You won't," Harry said, and ended the exchange with a single, precise banishing charm that caught her mid-lunge and threw her bodily into the garden wall hard enough to crack stone, not gently, not performed for anyone's benefit, but simply, exactly as much force as the moment required, and not 1 ounce less, the same discipline he'd carried into a room of requirement duel in October, and never once set down. She didn't rise again immediately, groaning in the wreckage of broken stone, and Harry didn't finish her. Not out of mercy exactly, more because Ginny needed him elsewhere, and Bellatrix, for the moment, was no longer capable of being anyone's immediate problem. He found Neville near the garden's far wall, breathing hard, sort of Gryffindoring hand, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his, and understood, in the flash of recognition that passed between them, that Neville had been the one holding the line against Nagini this whole time, alone, because nobody else in the garden had a blade capable of actually harming her. "She keeps circling back," Neville said, breathless. "I've had 2 strikes and missed both. She's faster than she looks." Together then. Harry didn't waste time on more than that. He drew the snake's attention with a stinging hex that caught her mid-flank, sharp enough to provoke without wounding seriously, and watched her coil and strike toward him with a speed that would have ended a slower wizard's war right there in the trampled snow. He stepped aside at the last possible instant, close enough that her scales brushed his sleeve, and in the half-second her strike carried her past him, overextended and briefly, fatally uncommitted. Neville brought Gryffindor's sword down in a single clean arc that ended 11 years of Voldemort's carefully hoarded insurance in a length of steel that had waited, patient as anything Harry now understood patience to mean, 500 years for exactly this moment. The Guinea's death arrived in Harry's awareness like a struck bell, a note he felt rather than heard, and underneath the ordinary, sharp wrongness of any violent death, something else entirely, a second signature, ancient and rotten and furious, tearing free of the snake's body the same way the Horcrux fragment had torn free of the ring in a ruined cottage 2 months before. Harry felt it, whole and unmistakable, a portion of Voldemort's own soul unmade in the same garden his family had bled defending, and understood, with a clarity that arrived faster than thought, exactly what death had meant, in a churchyard, about debts finally coming due. He didn't have time to feel anything more complicated than that. Before the garden's noise changed pitch entirely, every Death Eater still standing turning, as one, toward the orchard's edge, where a tall, robed figure had appeared without any sound at all. And Harry understood that Voldemort had felt his snake die too, and had come, personally, to see who had done it. The fighting stopped, or rather, rearranged itself. Death Eaters falling back toward their master with a particular haste of men who understood exactly what his temper was about to demand of somebody. Voldemort stood at the orchard's edge in the strobing dark red eyes finding Harry across 30 feet of trampled snow and scattered curse light, and for a long moment neither of them moved at all, the whole garden holding its breath around a silence that felt, to Harry, considerably louder than the battle it had replaced. "Potter," Voldemort said, finally, and there was something in the single word that hadn't been there the last time they'd faced each other across an open space 3 years before, in a graveyard not so very different from the churchyard where all of this had actually begun. Something almost like recognition, still forming, still refusing to complete itself. "You have been busy this winter. You've been chasing ghosts," Harry said. "Gregorovich's mostly. I'd have told you to stop months ago and saved you the trouble, except I rather liked watching you waste the effort." Something flickered across Voldemort's ruined face, quick and cold. "The wand. Not anymore yours to worry about. It hasn't been anyone's business but mine since October." Harry let that land, watching the calculation behind Voldemort's eyes accelerate, old fear finding new shape. "I know what you've spent 6 years building, Tom. 6 safeguards, Snape tells me. Though I suspect he undercounted, and I suspect you know exactly why I'd suspect that." He kept his voice level, unhurried, the register he'd spent an autumn learning to wear like a second skin. "I'm not here to fight you with a better spell. I did that once when I was 11 and got lucky, and I've spent every year since watching you come back from luckier and luckier defeats because luck was never actually the thing keeping you alive. I'm here to collect on what you actually owe." "You understand nothing," Voldemort said, and his voice had gone very soft, very controlled, the register of a man reciting a truth he had told himself so many times it had stopped requiring conviction. "I conquered death, Potter. While your precious Dumbledore hoarded his little secrets and told himself restraint was wisdom, I did what no wizard in 1,000 years dared attempt. I made myself unkillable. I am not a man anymore, standing here in front of you. I am 7 answers to a single question that has terrified every witch and wizard who ever lived, and you cannot end what has already stopped being singular." "You didn't conquer death," Harry said, and felt, for the first time since the fighting had stopped, the cold, load-bearing certainty of the churchyard settle fully over him again, vast and quiet and entirely his own to wield. "You hid from it. You tore yourself into pieces and scattered the pieces across half of Britain and called the hiding a victory because nobody's ever had the authority to make you answer for it before." He drew the Elder Wand, unhurried, no threat in the motion, simply fact. "I do." Voldemort's eyes narrowed, some old and terrible arithmetic assembling itself behind them, faster than Harry had expected, because whatever else the man had become across 50 years of ambition, he had never once been slow. "The rumors," he said, quiet, almost to himself. "The wandless Death Eaters. The Wizengamot committee that suddenly began slowing my gold to a crawl. The Dementor that would not obey a direct order from one of my own last week, and instead simply stood and watched me pass, as though waiting for permission it had not yet been given." Something shifted in his ruined face, calculation giving way, slowly and visibly, to a dawning that had no comfortable place left to land. "You, all of it you. Since when?" "Since a boy in a dead man's room worked out you were never going to let him choose his own ending," Harry said. "You should have killed me cleanly in that nursery 16 years ago, Tom, while you still had the chance to do it before I understood what any of this meant. You didn't. You left a scar instead, and a piece of yourself in it, and I've spent this whole year turning that mistake into the exact authority you're about to lose everything to." For the first time in the entire exchange, something crossed Voldemort's face that was not calculation, not fury, not the practiced contempt Harry had watched him wear in every prior meeting. It was, unmistakably, however briefly, the shape of a man beginning to understand he had already lost an argument he hadn't realized he was having. What happened next did not look, to the Death Eaters watching from the orchard's shadow, like a duel at all, and several of them would spend the rest of their lives trying and failing to adequately describe it to anyone who hadn't stood in that garden. Voldemort struck first, a killing curse thrown with the speed and precision of a man who had ended more lives than he could accurately count, green light lancing across the trampled snow toward a target who did not dodge, did not shield, did not do anything at all except stand entirely still and let it arrive. It should have ended there. Harry understood that, distantly, in the fraction of a second the curse took to cross the garden, understood it with the same wordless certainty that had once told him a ring was ready to be pierced. He was not invulnerable. Death had told him as much, plainly, in a churchyard, and he had believed it then and believed it now. But he had also spent 2 months learning, patiently, exactly what he now held authority over, and in the half-second before the curse would have touched him, he reached, not for a shield, but for the boundary itself, the thin, patient membrane Death had shown him how to perceive, between a living thing and the ending waiting to claim it, and he closed his hand around at the basilisk fang, and simply refused the curse admission. The green light didn't rebound, the way it had at Godric's Hallows 16 years before, some accident of a mother's love turning a weapon back upon its caster. It simply stopped, a foot from Harry's chest, hanging in the winter air for one impossible, suspended second, and then unraveled, thread by thread, into nothing at all. Because the working it was built on, an ending forced rather than freely given, no longer had any purchase to force itself through. The garden went utterly silent. Even Bellatrix had stopped laughing. "That's not possible," Voldemort said, and for the first time in Harry's experience of him, across 3 years and 2 prior meetings, his voice cracked, just slightly, around the edge of something that might, in a lesser man, have been called fear. It is now. Harry took a step forward and felt the ground beneath his feet answer to something that wasn't quite gravity anymore. An old and patient attention gathering itself around the whole garden the way it had gathered itself around a churchyard in December. "You built your safety out of theft, Tom. 6 thefts plus tonight makes 7, and every single one of them was owed back eventually, to me now. Because I hold the debt you spent your whole life refusing to acknowledge existed. I'm not here to duel you for the ministry or for revenge, or for anything as small as either of those things. I'm here because death itself has a claim on you that's gone unanswered for 50 years. And I am, as of this December, the only authority in this world with the standing to collect it." He felt it happen before he consciously chose to make it happen, the way he'd felt the ring ready itself in a ruined cottage, the way he'd felt Nagini's death arrive as a struck bell minutes before. He reached not toward Voldemort directly, but toward the whole scattered architecture of his theft. 6 anchors built from murder and arrogance, and a refusal so total it had cost him his own face, and found them one by one, with an ease that frightened him slightly, even as he did it. A locket, long destroyed. Dumbledore's own quiet work with a house elf's help back in December. A diary, destroyed 4 years past in a chamber under this very island. A ring, destroyed by his own hand in a dead family's front room. A snake, destroyed minutes ago by a friend's steady blade. And 2 more, distant, hidden, humming faintly at the very edge of what he could perceive. A cup, gold and ancient, buried deep beneath a bank that had stood, unbothered, for 1,000 years. A diadem, lost and forgotten in a room the castle itself had swallowed and hidden from anyone unworthy of finding it. He did not travel to either of them. He did not need to. He simply reached the way death had shown him how to reach in a churchyard and called due what was owed. Far beneath Gringotts, in a vault sealed by goblin magic older than the ministry itself, past dragon-guarded chambers no living wizard had entered in a generation, a golden cup engraved with a badger sat undisturbed among heaped coin and glittering, forgotten treasure, and in the space of a single-held breath it simply stopped being what it had been for 50 years. Gold dulling, the ancient malice coiled inside it unraveling into nothing, with a sound at night with its that's to gargadits folkiterate of stirred by that is lows in a hidden room at Hogwarts, a chamber that admitted only those with a genuine need to conceal something and had, across 1,000 years of use, stored everything from stolen love letters to smuggled contraband, a tarnished, forgotten diadem balanced atop a broken bust in a mountain of accumulated debris, waiting exactly where a frightened, ambitious boy had hidden it decades before, and it answered the same call, the same instant, the same unmaking, its old and patient malice guttering out the way a candle gutters when the last of its wax finally, entirely gave way. Both fragments answered at once, tearing themselves loose from vault and hidden room alike, unmade the way the ring's fragment had been unmade, the way the diary's ghost had been unmade 4 years before. Gone, all at once, in 2 places at once, hundreds of miles apart, and a single garden away from the man they had once belonged to. The way a debt is settled the instant a ledger finally balances. And then, last of all, closest of all, he felt his own. He had known it was there for months, a small, cold, watchful splinter lodged behind his own scar since he was 15 months old, and he had learned, across an autumn of practice, to carry it the way you carry any old wound, present but unexamined. He felt it answer the same call the others had answered, felt it strain against the binding that had held it to him for 16 years, and understood in the same instant exactly what Dumbledore had once called the hope in a office full of silver instruments, that the fragment might be called due without the vessel carrying it being called due, without the vessel carrying it being called due alongside it. He had never intended to test that hope this way. Deliberately, in the middle of a war he'd already decided to win on entirely different terms. But the debt, once opened, did not ask his permission about which of its 8 pieces to collect, and he stood very still, teeth gritted against a cold that had nothing to do with the winter air, and let it happen anyway, trusting the authority he now held to know the difference between a piece that belonged to him and a piece that had only ever been squatting behind his eyes. Uninvited, it left him the way the others had left their vaults in hidden rooms, all at once, entirely, a small cold absence where a small cold presence had sat unnoticed for 16 years, and Harry staggered, once, catching himself against nothing but his own suddenly lighter balance, and understood, with a clarity that arrived like sunrise after a very long night, that he was, for the first time since he was 15 months old, entirely and only himself. Voldemort screamed. It was not a sound Harry had ever heard him make, not in a graveyard 3 years before, not in any memory Dumbledore had ever shown him. A sound with nothing performed in it at all, no theater, no cruelty, only the raw, animal shock of a man who had spent 50 years building a fortress against his own mortality, watching every wall of it come down in the same instant, from the inside, with no warning and no mercy in the collapse. He staggered, hand flying to his own chest, as though something inside it had physically torn, and Harry watched. With an unnamed emotion he made no attempt to catalog. The last of 6 stolen anchors finished burning away into whatever waited on the other side of the debt he'd just called in. What stood in the garden afterward was not, quite, the same thing that had walked out of the orchard shadow minutes before. Voldemort straightened, slowly, breathing hard, and something in his ruined face had changed, not softened. Nothing so simple as that, but exposed. In a way Harry understood instinctively he had never once allowed himself to be exposed before, not even in front of his most loyal servants. He was, for the first time since his rebirth 3 years past, entirely, singularly mortal, one soul and one body with nowhere else in the world to hide the rest of himself. And he knew it, and the knowing had stripped something out of his voice that Harry suspected had never once, in 50 years, been stripped out of it before. "You've killed me," Voldemort said, quiet now, almost wondering. "Not yet," Harry said. "You're still standing." "That was never in question, though. Nagini was your last hiding place. Everything after this is just you, facing what you spent 50 years running from, the way every single person you ever murdered had to face it without warning." He raised the Elder Wand, unhurried, and felt the whole garden's held breath gather around the two of them. Death Eaters frozen at the garden, without nuding to be told, that were watching the held breath had gathered throughout the queue. "I'm not going to make this a show. You don't deserve theater, and I'm not interested in giving you one. This is a debt. I'm collecting it." Voldemort tried, at the very end, the only thing he had ever truly known how to try. He attacked, wandless fury given shape in a curse thrown with everything 50 years of dark mastery could still produce. And Harry met it, not with the Elder Wand's raw power, though that would have been more than sufficient, but with something quieter and, in its own way, considerably older. He simply stood in the curse's path the way he'd stood in the path of the killing curse minutes before, and let the authority death had granted him do what authority of that particular kind was always ultimately for. He closed the door. The curse didn't rebound. It didn't unravel dramatically, the way the first one had. It simply arrived at the boundary of what Harry now held dominion over, and found, waiting there, no admission at all, the same patient, absolute refusal a locked door offers a hand that has never once, in its life, been given a key. Voldemort's own overextension did the rest. He staggered forward, off balance, momentum, and 50 years of never once needing to consider his own physical mortality, carrying him 3 steps past where his feet should have stopped, and Harry, watching him come, did not raise the Elder Wand to strike a killing blow of his own. He simply reached out, unhurried, and touched 2 fingers to the center of Voldemort's chest, the way you might touch a door to confirm, gently, that it was already closing. The last piece of Tom Riddle's fractured, ancient, exhausted soul went out like a candle starved of air. No scream this time, no theater, no final curse thrown in desperate fury, just a body, suddenly and entirely empty, folding to the trampled snow of a garden it had come to destroy, in the same silence that had swallowed 6 other fragments of the same soul over the preceding 2 months, patient and total, and, in the end, almost gentle. Harry stood over what was left for a long moment, feeling nothing he had words ready for, and understood, distantly, that somewhere just past the edge of what his living eyes could properly perceive, an old and courteous attention had gathered itself, one final time that night, not to claim him, but to claim the debt he had spent 2 months learning how to collect on Death's own behalf. "You did that cleanly," the voice said, arriving the way understanding always arrived now, already complete. "Cleaner than most executions I have witnessed in 4,000 years of witnessing them. I want you to know that I noticed, Harry Potter, and that it will be remembered on the ledger that actually matters, long after this garden has forgotten tonight ever happened." "Is it over?" Harry asked, aloud, not caring, in that moment, how strange he must have looked to anyone watching, speaking to an empty garden over a dead man's body. "The war, very nearly. The rest of what you have built, Not remotely. That part, Harry Potter, is only just beginning. And I find I am, for reasons that will not surprise you, rather curious to see what you make of it. The Death Eaters scattered within minutes, Bellatrix included, apparating away in twos and threes the instant the shock of what they'd witnessed gave way to the older, more familiar instinct of self-preservation. Nobody chased them. Nobody, in that garden, had the energy left to, and Harry understood watching them go, that there would be time enough later to finish what tonight had only begun to unravel. Mr. Menson-Verm. Weasley reached him first, blood on his sleeve, face pale but steady, and put a hand on Harry's shoulder with the particular gravity of a man who had just watched something he'd spend the rest of his life trying to properly describe to people who hadn't been there. "Are you hurt?" "No," Harry said, and found, checking, that it was true, not a scratch on him. Though something in his chest felt scoured out and enormous, the aftermath of authority spent at a scale he hadn't fully appreciated until the spending was finished. "Mr." Weasley held his gaze a moment longer, some private calculation working itself out behind his tired eyes. "You went straight for us," he said, quietly. Not quite a question either. The moment the ward screamed, "I want you to know we noticed that, Harry. Whatever authority you're carrying now, whatever it lets you do, you still came running for an ordinary family in an ordinary garden before you did anything else with it. You're not ordinary," Harry said. "None of you ever have been. That's rather the whole reason I came running." Ginny reached him next, breathless, a shallow cut along one cheekbone she didn't seem to have noticed yet, and looked down at Voldemort's body with an expression Harry couldn't fully read, before looking back up at him instead. "You did it," she said, quiet, not quite a question. "It's actually over." "Mostly," Harry said. "There's still a war-shaped mess to clean up, Death Eaters who will need rounding up, a ministry that's going to have a great many uncomfortable questions for me, probably starting tomorrow." He looked down at what remained of the man who'd killed his parents, who'd hunted him across 16 years of a life he'd never once asked for, and felt the last of the night's cold load-bearing certainty finally begin to ease into something closer to ordinary exhaustion. But yeah, this parties, he's not coming back from this one. There's nothing left of him to come back with. Neville found them a moment later, sword still in hand, and looked between Harry and the body with the dazed expression of a boy who had, in the space of a single night, gone from timid to essential without ever quite noticing the transition happen. "I killed her," he said quietly, meaning Nagini, meaning it as confession rather than boast. "I've never killed anything before. Not like that. You ended a monster that had already ended more lives than either of us will ever know the full count of," Harry said, and meant every word of it. "That's not the same thing as killing, Neville. I need you to believe that because I think you're going to need it, some nights, and I'm not going to be able to give it to you every single time you need reminding." Neville nodded slowly and didn't answer, and Harry understood that some costs, even on a night this decisively won, were not his alone to carry, and that the war, however finished its central villain now was, had left marks on every single person standing in that garden that no dominion he now held would ever be able to fully undo. Ron and Hermione found him last, having spent the final minutes of the fight helping Bill drag two wounded Death Eaters into a corner where they could be watched rather than left to bleed unattended. A small, deliberate mercy, Harry noted and understood, without needing it explained, as exactly the kind of choice the two of them had always made without being asked. Hermione's hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up with her now that there was nothing left to direct it at, and Ron's sleeve was soaked through above the cut he hadn't yet let anyone look at properly. "You're all right," Hermione said, close to him now, checking him over with quick, clinical hands despite her own shaking, the particular fussing she did when she couldn't yet trust herself to simply feel something without also doing something useful alongside it. "You're actually all right." "I'm all right." Harry caught her hands briefly, stilling them, and felt something in his chest ease at the contact, small and grounding against the enormity of everything that had just happened. "You held the north flank the whole fight. I felt the wards steady, right when I needed them to. I did what needed doing." She glanced past him, toward the body in the snow, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite triumph, and wasn't quite horror. Some complicated third thing Harry suspected he'd be seeing on a great many faces over the coming weeks. "Is it really over? The way you said to Ginny? Really over, not just this battle over?" "I think so," Harry said honestly. "I felt it when the last piece went. There's nothing left of him to rebuild from. No backup plan, no seventh trick up his sleeve. Just a body, and whatever's left of the debt he still owes for everything he did with the 50 years he stole." He looked at Ron, at the blood on his sleeve, at the exhausted, unshaken steadiness in his oldest friend's face. "Thank you, both of you, for being here, for everything since October, honestly, but especially for tonight." "Save your thanks," Ron said, with the ghost of his usual humor finally creeping back in, "and go let someone look at that cut on Ginny's face before Mum notices and has all our heads for it." Dumbledore arrived 20 minutes later, too late for the fighting and exactly in time for the aftermath, and stood over Voldemort's body for a long, silent moment before he spoke. "I felt it," he said finally, quiet, older than Harry had ever heard him sound. "From the castle, Every ward in Britain that has ever been key to his presence, and there are more of those than you would credit, felt something enormous unmake itself tonight, all at once, across half the country. He looked up, and Harry watched him take in the whole scene properly for the first time, the scattered evidence of battle, the exhausted blood-marked faces of the people who'd fought it. Harry himself standing in the middle of all of it, with a stillness that hadn't been there in October. You did not simply defeat him tonight, Harry. You ended something that has haunted this world for 50 years, in a single evening, in a garden I have visited 100 times for considerably gentler reasons. Something moved across his face, old grief and older relief tangled together past easy separation. Thank you. I do not say that lightly, and I do not say it as your headmaster. I say it as a man who spent 60 years failing to finish what you finished tonight in the space of a single conversation and a single closed door. Harry looked at him, and at the garden, and at the small, exhausted crowd of people who had fought beside him and were, even now, beginning the long work of tending each other's wounds, and understood that the war everyone had spent years dreading had ended, finally, not with the grand cataclysm the prophecy had always implied, but with a debt quietly, thoroughly collected, and a body in the snow that would never again threaten anyone at all. Snape arrived as the last of the order finished securing the garden's perimeter, robes dark against the churned snow, and stood a long moment over Voldemort's body with an expression Harry had genuinely never seen him wear before, something that might, in a kinder light, have been called grief, and might, in a harder one, have been called relief so total it had briefly overwhelmed everything else a face could show at once. He had spent 16 years serving this man, in one capacity or another, first as a follower, and then as the most dangerous kind of traitor. The kind who smiles while he does it, and Harry understood, watching him, that whatever this moment meant to everyone else in the garden, it meant something else again to Severus Snape, older and more complicated than triumph. It is done then, Snape said finally, not quite a question. It's done. I find I do not know what to do with the rest of my evening. It was said flatly, almost dryly, but there was something underneath it that Harry recognized, distantly, as the sound of a man discovering, all at once, that a purpose he had organized the whole of his adult life around no longer existed, to organize around. I have spent 16 years preparing for a moment I was reasonably confident I would not survive to see. I confess the sensation of surviving it regardless is somewhat disorienting. You'll work it out, Harry said, and meant it as something closer to kindness than he usually managed to offer the man, and watched Snape's expression flicker, briefly, into something that might have been surprise at receiving it. Get some sleep first. That's an order, if you want to call it one. You've earned it more than almost anyone standing in this garden tonight. Snape studied him a moment longer, then inclined his head, the closest thing to a bow Harry had ever seen him offer anyone, and turned to help Kingsley with the wounded, leaving Harry alone with Dumbledore in the settling quiet. Don't thank me yet, Harry said finally, and meant it as honestly as he'd meant anything all night. This was the easy part, in a strange way. Deciding what to do with everything I'm holding now that he's gone, that's the part I haven't worked out yet. No, Dumbledore agreed, quiet, watching the last of the garden's chaos resolve itself into ordinary, exhausted aftermath around them. I do not imagine you have. I do not imagine anyone could in the space of a single evening, however momentous. But I would offer you this much, Harry, for whatever it is worth, from an old man who has made every mistake available to a person in your position, and a few besides. You ended tonight the way you began this whole endeavor in October, with your eyes open, your friends beside you, and your own conscience still fully, stubbornly intact. Whatever comes next, and I suspect a great deal is about to come next, rather quickly, I would build it on exactly that foundation and no other. It is, in my considerable experience, the only foundation strong enough to hold what you are now capable of building on top of it. Harry stayed in the garden long after the last of the order had finished their work, long after Mrs. Weasley had finally been persuaded indoors, still shaking, to put the kettle on for a crowd of exhausted survivors who needed tea considerably more than they needed anything else just then. He stood alone over the place where Voldemort's body had lain before the Ministry's people arrived to take custody of it. Snow already beginning to soften the trampled ground back toward stillness, and felt, for the first time since October, something like the absence of a weight he'd carried so long he'd stopped fully registering its shape. It didn't feel like triumph, exactly. He turned the sensation over, honestly, the way he'd turned over every strange new feeling since a book had fallen open in a dead man's room, and decided finally that it felt closer to the particular quiet after a held breath finally, fully lets go, spent and clear and not yet certain what comes next. Only certain that whatever it was, he intended to build it deliberately. The same way he'd built it everything since that first cold October night, with his eyes open and his own hands steady on the wheel. He looked up, once, at the sky above the orchard, stars showing clear now that the last of the curse light had faded, and thought, distantly, that somewhere past the edge of what his eyes could properly perceive, an old and patient attention was very probably still watching, curious, as promised, to see what he made of everything that came next. He turned finally and walked back toward the house, toward Ginny and Ron and Hermione, and a kettle already beginning to whistle, and let the cold night settle behind him. Quiet and finished, and entirely his to walk away from on his own 2 feet. Inside, the kitchen was warm and crowded and loud in the particular way a house gets loud after real danger has passed through it and left everyone still standing, still whole enough to talk over each other about it. Mrs. Mistone. Weasley pressed a mug into his hands before he'd fully cleared the doorway, and Ginny made room for him on the bench without being asked, and Ron was already 3 sentences into an exaggerated retelling of his own small part in the evening that had Fred and George arrive by flew within the hour, laughing despite everything. Harry sat among all of it, warm hands around a warm mug, and let the ordinary noise of a family that had chosen him wash over him the way the cloak's silence used to, not blocking anything out, simply reminding him, gently, insistently, exactly what all of tonight's terrible arithmetic had actually been for. He caught Hermione watching him once across the crowded table, and she didn't say anything, didn't need to. She simply held his gaze a moment, something steady and unshaken passing between them, and went back to arguing with Ron about the precise, exaggerated number of Death Eaters he claimed to have personally disarmed. Harry let the warmth of the kitchen close back over him, and understood, sitting there, that whatever came next, whatever shape the rest of this war's long aftermath eventually took, he had exactly what he needed to meet it already sitting around this table, and that no dominion he now held would ever matter half as much as that plain, stubborn fact. Outside, past the frosted windows, the garden lay quiet under fresh snow, already beginning to erase the night's evidence the way winters always eventually did, patient and thorough and entirely indifferent to the scale of what had just ended there. Harry didn't look out at it again. He didn't need to. He had carried enough of that particular weight for one evening, and the rest of it, he understood, could wait for morning, and for whatever came after morning, and for however long it actually took to build something worth all of it out of a night like this one. Chapter 6, End. Chapter 7. The Terms of the Throne. The Ministry took 11 days to work out what to do with him, which struck Harry, watching the process unfold from a careful distance, as approximately 10 days longer than it should have taken, and exactly as long as he'd expected from an institution built to move slowly even when the alternative was catastrophic. The story broke on the second day, inevitably, because a garden full of Weasleys, Order members, and captured Death Eaters was never going to stay quiet for long. And by the third, the Daily Prophet had abandoned its careful, denial-shaped coverage of the war entirely in favor of a headline, so large it barely fit the front page: WHO defeated, Harry Potter confirmed victor. The article beneath it got almost nothing right about the how, which suited Harry fine, since he had not yet decided how much of the how he intended to share with anyone beyond the small circle who'd already earned it. He spent the following days at the Burrow mostly, fielding a slow, escalating tide of owls, congratulations, gratitude, a marriage proposal from a witch in Cardiff he'd never met, 3 separate requests from Daily Prophet reporters for exclusive interviews, and, on the 5th day, a formal summons from the Minister for Magic himself, requesting Harry's presence before a special session of the Wizengamot to discuss, in the letter's carefully bureaucratic phrasing, matters of considerable and urgent public significance arising from recent events. He'd decided, reading the summons twice over breakfast, that avoiding the confrontation would only delay a conversation he needed to have eventually, and that having it on his own timing, deliberately, was considerably better than having it forced on him by rumor and pressure a month down the line. Not every letter that reached him that week was kind. A handful, unsigned, accused him of arrogance, of playing at godhood, of exactly the overreach Dumbledore had warned him about in a churchyard the previous December, and he read each one carefully rather than dismissing them out of hand. Because he decided, somewhere over the autumn, that the people most worth listening to about the danger of unchecked power were often the ones frightened enough to write anonymously rather than the ones cheering loudest. He didn't answer any of them directly. He simply kept the worry they raised somewhere close at hand, a counterweight against the flood of gratitude threatening, some mornings, to convince him he'd earned a kind of trust that hadn't actually finished being earned yet. The Wizengamot chamber was fuller than Harry had ever seen it. Benches packed tier upon tier with witches and wizards in formal robes, a hum of anticipation running through the room that quieted, all at once, the moment he walked through the doors with Dumbledore at his side and Ron and Hermione a step behind, present as witnesses rather than defendants this time, a distinction Harry noted with some private, grim satisfaction given the last time he'd stood in this particular room. Cornelius Fudge's successor, a tired, competent witch named Griselda Marchbanks, who had inherited the ministry's top office in the chaos of the previous administration's collapse, opened proceedings with the particular formality of someone who understood exactly how much history was about to be made in the room and was determined not to let the occasion get away from her. "Mr. Martentime, Potter," she said, from the raised central seat, "you stand accused of nothing here today. I want that stated plainly for the record before we begin. You are here at the Wizengamot's request to provide testimony regarding events of considerable public interest, and to answer, if you are willing, certain questions this body and the wider wizarding public have found themselves unable to answer without your assistance." She paused, and something in her weathered face suggested she'd rehearse the next part carefully. "We understand you are, in some capacity not yet fully explained to this chamber, responsible for the death of he who must not be named. We would like to understand that capacity. Harry stood in the center of the chamber, in the same chair, he noted distantly, where he'd once sat as a 14-year-old facing expulsion over a Patronus charm cast to save his own life, and found that the old fear the room had once held for him simply wasn't there anymore, burned away sometime in the last 3 months along with a great deal else. "I'll tell you the truth," he said, "because I think the truth serves everyone in this room better than whatever version rumors already constructed without it. And because I'm tired of watching this ministry make decisions based on half information, the way it did for most of the last 2 years I attended school here." He let that land, watching several faces on the upper benches shift uncomfortably, memories of Umbridge's tenure clearly not yet buried deep enough to escape the implication. "Last December, I completed a piece of very old, very difficult magic. I became what the old stories call the Master of Death. I don't say that to be dramatic. I say it because it's the only accurate word for what I now hold, and because I'd rather this chamber understand the actual shape of it than spend the next decade guessing." The silence that followed had a texture Harry recognized from a churchyard, from a garden, from every moment since October when the true weight of something had finally landed on the people around him. "What does that mean?" Marchbanks asked, carefully. "In practical terms, for this ministry, and for the wizarding world it governs, it means Voldemort is not coming back. Not through any means anyone currently understands, not through any Horcrux, not through any ritual, because I hold, now, the authority to ensure exactly that outcome, and I intend to keep holding it." Harry kept his voice level, unhurried, the register he'd built across a whole difficult autumn. "It means I am not interested in your office, Minister. I want that stated plainly too, for the record, since I suspect it's the question half this room actually came here to have answered. I don't want to run the ministry. I don't want a seat on this bench, or a title, or a throne, whatever shape people have started imagining one might take. I want the freedom to keep doing what I've spent the last 3 months doing, finding the places where dark magic is quietly rebuilding itself, and ending them, precisely, before they become the next war instead of a footnote in this one. And if this body disagrees with your methods, then I'd ask you to bring me evidence and we'll discuss it, the way any citizen ought to be held accountable," Harry said. "I'm not asking to be above your laws, Minister. I'm telling you, honestly, that I now hold authority your laws were never written to anticipate, and I think we're all better served if this chamber and I work out, together, over time, what oversight of that authority actually looks like, rather than either of us pretending the question doesn't exist." He looked around the chamber, meeting as many eyes as he could in the time it took to turn his head. "I watched this ministry fail spectacularly twice at recognizing a threat until it was nearly too late to stop. I'm not interested in becoming a third failure of exactly that kind, on the opposite end of the mistake. I'd rather build something that survives scrutiny than something that simply survives because nobody's brave enough to scrutinize it." Not every question came in good faith. Lucius Malfoy, seated in his customary place among the Wizengamot's old family benches, his composure only slightly frayed at the edges since the collapse of everything he'd spent the war quietly funding, rose partway through the session with a particular oiled courtesy Harry remembered from a bookshop confrontation years before. "A remarkable claim, Mr. Potter," Malfoy said, delivered with, if I may say, remarkable confidence for a 16-year-old asking this body to simply take his word for an authority no one in this chamber can verify, examine, or meaningfully oversee. Forgive me if I find myself less immediately reassured than my colleagues seem to be." "You're welcome to your doubts, Mr. Malfoy," Harry said, and let just enough of the garden's cold, load-bearing certainty into his voice to make the temperature of the room shift, subtly, around the exchange. "I'd be more interested in your doubts, honestly, if they weren't coming from a man who spent the autumn laundering Voldemort's gold through ministry reconstruction contracts via 3 shell purchases traceable, with about 4 days of patient research, straight back to his own signature. I haven't brought that evidence before this chamber yet. I'd rather not need to. But I want you to understand, plainly, in front of everyone currently deciding how much oversight to extend me, that I am considerably better informed about exactly who in this room has earned scrutiny than anyone here has yet given me credit for." The color left Malfoy's face by careful degrees, and he sat back down without further comment, and Harry watched the rest of the chamber recalibrate around the exchange, understanding, all at once, exactly how much more thoroughly they were dealing with than a gifted duelist with a useful trick. Marchbanks, for her part, made a small, precise note on the parchment in front of her and did not ask Harry to elaborate, which he took, correctly, as its own kind of understanding passing between them. The session ran 4 more hours after that, questions circling the same handful of anxieties from a dozen different angles, and Harry answered each one with the same patient, unhurried honesty, watching the room's fear slowly, incompletely, begin to resolve into something closer to wary respect. By the end of it, the Wizengamot had passed, by an overwhelming margin, a resolution establishing what the assembled press would spend the following week calling, with varying degrees of accuracy, the Office of Special Magical Oversight, an independent authority, answerable to no single ministry department, charged with identifying and neutralizing threats no conventional Auror force could safely handle, headed, by unanimous and somewhat relieved vote, by one Harry James Potter, age 16. He hadn't asked for the formal title. He'd have been content, honestly, to simply keep doing the work without a name attached to it. But Dumbledore, walking with him out of the chamber afterward, had offered a piece of wisdom Harry recognized. even as he heard it, as some of the most useful advice the old man had given him all year. Power without a name, Dumbledore said, is power other people will spend considerable energy trying to name for you, usually less generously than you'd like. Let them call it an office. Let them build committees around it and oversight boards and all the tedious architecture bureaucracies build around anything they're frightened of and wish to feel they understand. It will cost you very little in practice, since you and I both know no committee alive could meaningfully constrain what you actually hold. But it will cost the frightened considerably less to sleep at night, believing you answerable to something, and I have found across a long life that a frightened populace makes considerably worse decisions than a reassured one, even when the reassurance is, in the end, largely ceremonial. Bellatrix Lestrange had been recaptured within the week, cornered in a safe house near the Welsh border by a joint order and order operation Harry had deliberately let run without his own direct involvement, wanting the ministry to rebuild some confidence in its own capability rather than simply defer to his everywhere from the start. She would stand trial in the spring, along with 24 others rounded up in the chaotic weeks following Voldemort's fall, and Harry had made a point, privately, of not attending a single one of the hearings, understanding that his presence in that particular room would tilt every verdict toward whatever he seemed to want, rather than what the evidence actually supported. It was, he'd found, one of the harder disciplines of the whole new authority, knowing exactly when the most powerful thing he could do was simply not show up. You're telling me to let them think they can check me? I am telling you that the appearance of accountability is not the same as its absence, and that wise rulers throughout history, the rare few who deserve the word, have generally understood the difference and used it kindly. Something old and tired moved behind Dumbledore's eyes. I did not always understand it myself, at your age. I understand it now, largely because I spent 60 years watching what happens to men who refuse to let anything check them, even fictions. Voldemort is the far end of that refusal. I would not have you walk any part of that road, even the harmless-seeming first mile of it. Ron and Hermione were waiting outside the chamber doors, and Hermione fell into step beside him immediately, already turning the whole session over with the particular energy she brought to any problem she intended to solve properly, rather than simply survive. An independent office, she said, testing the phrase, answerable to no single department. That's actually rather clever, Harry, whoever drafted the wording. It gives you room to work without handing any single minister the ability to weaponize you against their political rivals. I had help with the wording, Harry admitted. More than help, honestly. I mostly just agreed to what Dumbledore suggested and tried to sound like I'd thought of it myself. You look like you thought of it yourself, Ron said, grinning. Very convincing. Malfoy looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him, which, credit where it's due, was probably the best 5 minutes of the whole 4 hours. It wasn't meant to be entertainment. No, Ron agreed, but it was, a bit, and I'm allowed to enjoy that part honestly, aren't I? He bumped Harry's shoulder, easy and familiar. Come on, Mum's got dinner waiting, and I imagine you'd rather eat it before the next owl arrives with another marriage proposal. He held the ring for 3 weeks before he used it, turning Dumbledore's advice and Death's own warning over in his mind in equal measure, and in the end it was not grief that finally moved his hand, but a kind of earned readiness. He recognized the moment it arrived, distinct and unmistakable, the way he'd recognized every genuine certainty since October. He went to the churchyard alone this time, on a clear night in February with frost thick on the ground and his parents' grave, exactly as he'd left it 2 months before, the old Peverell catching starlight instead of the deep December blue. He didn't bring Ron or Hermione, though he told them where he was going and why, and they'd let him go without argument, understanding by now precisely which moments in his life required company and which required its deliberate absence. He sat in front of the headstone a long while before he did anything else, letting the cold settle into him properly, honest and unhurried. Then he took the stone from his pocket, small and black and warm despite the frost, and turned it 3 times in his fingers. They came the way Death had described, months before, in the same churchyard. Not resurrection, not the desperate, wrongly summoned bride of the second brother's ruin, but a true and faithful visitation. His mother and father standing a few feet away in the frosted grass, solid enough to see clearly, insubstantial enough that he understood, without needing to be told twice, exactly what he was and wasn't being offered. His mother looked at him first, and her face did something complicated and enormous. 16 years of a son she'd only known as an infant compressed into a single unguarded moment of simply, finally seeing him grown. Harry, she said, and her voice was exactly as he'd always imagined it might be. From half-remembered screams and a single line and a pensive memory. Warmer than either had prepared him for. Look at you. He didn't trust his own voice for a long moment. When he found it, it came out rougher than he intended. I don't really know where to start. You don't have to start anywhere in particular, his father said, and there was James Potter's face, exactly as it looked in every photograph Harry owned. Younger than Harry had somehow expected, even having seen the pictures 100 times. Younger, he understood with a small shock, than Harry himself now felt some warnings. We know more than you'd think. It comes with the visiting, apparently. We've seen enough to know you didn't need us to save you tonight. You did that yourself. A long time before tonight, probably. They talked for the better part of an hour, about nothing enormous and everything that mattered. Quidditch and Hogwarts and the particular quality of Ron and Hermione's friendship, his mother asking careful, hungry questions about the small, ordinary texture of a childhood she'd never gotten to witness, his father laughing, once, at a story about Fred and George that Harry hadn't expected to make either of them laugh, and found, telling it, that it eased something in his chest he hadn't fully realized was still clenched. He told them about Sirius too, carefully, watching his father's face do something complicated at the mention of his oldest friend's name. Grief and old affection tangled together across a distance neither death nor visitation could fully close. He talked about you both constantly, Harry said, right up until the end. I think some part of him never really stopped being 17 and furious that the three of you didn't get to grow old together the way you were supposed to. His father was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had roughened in a way that mirrored Harry's own. Tell him, if you ever get the chance the way you're getting it with us, that I never once blamed him for any of it. Not for a single day, wherever I've been. I'd tell him myself. But I don't imagine the stone stretches quite that far, and I don't think he's ready for visiting yet regardless, wherever he's settled. He didn't ask them about the killing curse, or the war, or any of the enormous, unanswerable questions grief usually reached for first. He'd decided, walking into the churchyard, that he wanted this hour to be about the ordinary things death had stolen rather than the extraordinary ones, and found, living inside the decision, that it had been exactly the right one to make. When the hour ended, he felt it coming the way death had promised he would. A gentle, unmistakable pull toward the visitation's natural close, and he let it come without fighting it, without the desperate clinging that had undone the second brother 1,000 years before. I have to let you go now, he said, and his mother's face held nothing but a fierce, complete pride that steadied him more than any comfort could have. We were never really gone, love, she said. Not from where it matters. You'll understand that better than almost anyone alive now, I think. She reached out, and though he understood, distantly, that her hand would find no purchase against his, some warmth passed between them anyway. Faint and real and entirely enough. We're proud of you. Not for the power. For what you did with it tonight. Sitting here choosing an hour of nothing important over an hour of something desperate. That's the whole of it, really. That's all any parent actually wants for their child, in the end. They faded the way morning fog fades, gradually and then all at once, and Harry sat alone in the frosted churchyard afterward, the stone cooling in his palm, and found, checking honestly, that the ache underneath his ribs had changed shape entirely. From a wound with no bottom into something he could, for the first time, actually call by its right name, not gone, but carried, properly. The way grief was always supposed to be carried, and so rarely actually was. Death met him there again, once the visitation had fully faded, arriving the way it always arrived now, an old and patient attention gathering itself at the churchyard's edge without ceremony or warning. You used it correctly, Death said, and there was something in the ancient voice that Harry recognized, by now, as the closest thing to genuine warmth the vast presence ever offered anyone. An hour of ordinary things, chosen deliberately, released without a fight. Your ancestor took considerably longer to learn that particular grace, and he had, if I recall correctly, rather less cause than you to rush the lesson. I have a question, Harry said. You offered me authority in December. Dominion, you called it. I've been using it 3 months now, and I think I understand the shape of it reasonably well. But I don't understand the terms of it going forward. Is this permanent, temporary? Does it end when I do, or does it pass to someone else, the way the wind passes, or does it simply end entirely? A fair question, and one I confess I have been waiting for you to ask, rather than volunteering the answer unprompted, because I find the asking itself tells me a great deal about the asker. The dark seemed to settle, considering. The authority is yours for the span of your natural life, however long that proves to be, granted freely and without a leash. I did not already describe to you in December. It does not renew automatically upon your death, nor does it pass by inheritance, the way a wand's allegiance might. When you finally choose to lay it down, as every master of every Hallow eventually does, it will return to me, and I will wait, patiently, as I have waited before, for the next soul who asks the right question at the right time, with the right heart behind it. I do not know when that will be. I have learned, across 4,000 years, not to rush that particular calculation. And if I wanted more, if I asked for it to be permanent, passed down, an office, the way the ministry's building me one, except real, except yours, except lasting past my own death. Then I would decline you, Death said, and something in the ancient voice sharpened, briefly, into something that might, in a being so vast, have passed for genuine care, not out of cruelty, out of the same law that has governed every gift I have ever offered anyone, going back to 3 brothers on a riverbank who none of them, in the end, fully understood what they were asking for. Authority that outlives the wisdom that earned it curdles. Harry Potter, every single time, without exception, across every span of history I have personally witnessed. You hold what you hold because you asked correctly, and because I judged, in a churchyard in December, that your heart was equal to the asking. I will not extend that judgment to a hypothetical successor I have not yet met and cannot yet assess. That is not power. That is a throne, and thrones outlive the men wise enough to deserve them considerably more often than they don't. Harry stood with that a long moment, turning it over, and found, examining his own reaction honestly, that he was relieved rather than disappointed. "Good," he said finally. "I wasn't going to ask for it anyway. I just wanted to hear you say no, so I'd know the temptation wasn't mine to manage alone. It rarely is, in my experience," Death said. "That is rather the entire point of a law like mine. Temptation unmanaged alone is how every single one of your predecessors, across every gift I have ever offered, eventually failed. You have managed rather better than most this year, by the simple expedient of refusing to be alone with any of it for very long." "One more question," Harry said, and felt the weight of it even before he'd finished asking. Some old, unresolved thread from a churchyard in December finally ready to be pulled all the way through. "Voldemort. What happened to him after? Not the pieces I called due. Him. The last of him. The part that was still, technically, a man. He came to me," Death said, "as every soul eventually comes to me. And I will tell you, because I suspect you have earned the honesty, and because I do not believe the answer will comfort the parts of you still capable of a certain grim satisfaction, that there was no grand reckoning, no eternal punishment shaped to fit 50 years of cruelty. There rarely is, whatever the stories your world tells itself. He came to me frightened and small, and entirely alone in a way he had spent his whole unnatural life engineering himself never to be, and I received him the way I receive everyone, without cruelty and without mercy either, because I am not in the business of either, only of the appointment itself." A pause, vast and unhurried. "I will say this much, since I suspect it matters to you more than the metaphysics." He asked at the very end whether it had been you specifically who ended him, or merely an accident of circumstance he could have avoided with better preparation. I told him the truth. I imagine, of everything that happened to him that night, that particular answer cost him more than the ending itself. Harry sat with that a long moment, expecting some triumph to rise up and claim the moment, and finding instead only a quiet, settled sense of a debt genuinely closed, no theater left in it at all. "Thank you," he said finally, "for telling me honestly, even the part that wasn't satisfying to hear. I told you in December I do not lie to you, Harry Potter. I find that promise has served us both rather well thus far. I see no reason to abandon it now, satisfying or otherwise." Dumbledore found him at Hogwarts a week later, in the same office, the same silver instruments ticking softly on their tables, and this time it was Harry who'd requested the meeting, for reasons he'd spent several days deciding how honestly to voice. "I don't think we're going to be what we were," he said, without preamble, because preamble had stopped being a kindness he owed anyone months before. "Before all this. I've thought about it a lot, this last week, and I don't think there's a version of us that goes back to what it was in 4th year or even 5th. Too much happened. Too much of it was true and can't be untrue again just because we're on better terms now." "No," Dumbledore agreed, without hesitation, which told Harry, as it always did, that the old man had already arrived to the same conclusion alone, probably weeks before Harry had found the courage to voice it. "I do not think we will be either. I find, examining the thought honestly, that I do not entirely mourn it. What we were, Harry, was built on a foundation I have come to recognize as considerably less sound than I once believed it to be. An old man's comfortable assumption that his own judgment, however carefully exercised, was sufficient reason to decide the whole of another person's fate without their informed consent. I do not think I would wish to rebuild precisely that foundation, even if the rebuilding were somehow available to us. So what are we instead?" Dumbledore considered the question a long moment, genuine consideration rather than performed thoughtfulness, and when he answered, his voice held something Harry hadn't heard in it before, a kind of settled, unhurried honesty that felt, for the first time in 5 years, entirely without an angle underneath it. "I think we are two men who have done considerable harm and considerable good in each other's company, and who have, through a difficult and occasionally brutal process, arrived at something closer to honest respect than either affection or resentment alone could properly describe. I do not ask your forgiveness, Harry. I am not certain I have entirely earned it, and I have grown suspicious this year of forgiveness extended before it is genuinely earned, since I have watched what unearned forgiveness does to the debt it's meant to settle. Nothing at all, except bury it somewhere it can quietly fester." He met Harry's eyes, steady, unflinching. "I ask only that you allow me to remain useful to you, in whatever capacity you find honest use for, without requiring that usefulness to also carry the weight of an apology I am not certain either of us actually needs anymore." Harry sat with that a long moment, and found, testing it against everything he'd learned to test things against since October, that it was the truest thing Dumbledore had ever said to him. "All right," he said, "useful. Not forgiven, not unforgiven, just useful and honest, going forward." He extended his hand, an echo of the same gesture offered once before, across a room of requirements 6 months and a lifetime ago. "I can work with that." Dumbledore took it, and something passed between them that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite its absence either, something colder and more durable than either, built to last precisely because it had stopped pretending to be more than it actually was. "There is one more thing," Dumbledore said, as Harry rose to leave, and something in his voice made Harry pause at the door. I am considering retirement at the end of this school year, not because I no longer wish to be useful, but because I have come to believe this castle would benefit from a headmaster whose every decision is not still, in some quiet corner of the staff room, being weighed against the decisions he made regarding you. I have not yet decided who ought to replace me. I find, oddly, that I would value your opinion on the matter when the time comes. Though I understand if you consider that request an imposition I have not earned the right to make. I don't think it's an imposition, Harry said, honestly. I think it's the first time you've actually asked me something instead of deciding it and telling me after. I'll give you my opinion when you want it, properly though, not because you're trying to make up for anything, just because you asked. Just because I asked, Dumbledore repeated, and something in his weathered face eased fractionally into an expression that might, in a less complicated relationship, have simply been called gratitude. I find I would like very much to spend whatever years remain to me learning to operate on exactly those terms. Asking rather than deciding. It is, I confess, a considerably harder discipline at 80 than it would have been at 18. But I have never been a man who shied from difficult disciplines merely because he discovered them late. He stood on the astronomy tower that same evening, alone, the whole of the grounds spread out below him under a clear February sky, the lake a sheet of dark glass, the forbidden forest a black tangle stretching toward a horizon he could, if he let himself, feel all the way to the edge of, a faint hum of ordinary dying threaded quietly through every mile of it, patient and constant and finally, after months of practice, entirely bearable. He was not invincible. Death had told him as much in December and meant it, and he'd tested the truth of it himself in a garden, standing in the path of a curse he'd survived only because he'd understood, precisely, the boundary he was closing rather than simply hoping the boundary would hold. He would age. He would tire. Someday, decades or perhaps merely years from now, in a manner and at a moment he could not yet predict. He would lay down everything he currently carried and go, at last, the way the third brother had gone. As an old friend meeting an older one, not conquered and not conquering, simply arrived on his own terms at an appointment he had chosen the shape of, rather than had chosen for him. Until then, he understood, standing alone in the cold with the whole of a saved world spread quiet beneath him, there was work. Death Eaters still scattered and dangerous, needing to be found precisely and dealt with justly rather than cruelly. A ministry learning, slowly, to trust an authority it hadn't chosen and couldn't fully constrain. A wizarding world that would spend years, he suspected, deciding what to call him, settling eventually, he imagined, on some version of the same hushed, half-frightened, half-grateful reverence people had once reserved for stories about the Hallows themselves, not realizing, most of them, that the 16-year-old those stories now orbited had spent an entire autumn learning, painstakingly, precisely, that the whole of the power nighed, and he let himself feel the scale of it, deliberately, the way death had taught him to feel it that first night in December, not flinching from the enormity, not letting it consume him either, holding the whole vast weight of everything he now perceived at exactly the distance. A steady hand holds a full cup, careful, practiced, entirely under control. Somewhere below, in the castle's warm and lit windows, ordinary students were finishing ordinary homework, worrying about ordinary things, entirely unaware that the boundary between their world and the next had, 4 months earlier, acquired a keeper who took the keeping seriously. Somewhere further out, past the boundary of what even his authority could properly reach, the whole rest of the world went on turning, dying, and being born in the same patient rhythm it always had. Indifferent to any single wizard's dominion, however vast, and Harry found, standing with that indifference rather than against it, that it steadied him more than any reassurance could have. He was not the center of that rhythm. He was only, now, its careful and deliberate steward, and the distinction, he understood, was the whole of what would keep him human for as long as he managed to remember it. Ginny found him first, actually, climbing the last few steps ahead of the other two with the particular unhurried confidence she'd carried since October, and settled against the parapet beside him without a word. Close enough that her shoulder found his without either of them needing to arrange it. She didn't ask what he was thinking. She'd learned, months ago, that some silences were their own kind of answer, and she gave him this one freely. Watching the same dark rounds he was watching, patient and unbothered by the cold, Ron and Hermione found him there minutes later, climbing the tower's spiral stair with 2 mugs of tea gone lukewarm from the walk, and settled beside him without needing to ask permission, the way only 2 people who had earned that particular right across an entire difficult year were entitled to. "You've got that look again," Hermione said, handing him a mug, studying his face in the moonlight with the same careful attention she'd given him back in October, in a library corridor, when all of this had still been a secret he hadn't yet trusted her enough to share. "The one where you've gone somewhere the rest of us can't quite follow." "He does that less than he used to," Ginny said, before Harry could answer for himself. "I've been keeping count. Unofficially. He comes back faster every time." She glanced at him, something warm and unhurried in it. "That's not nothing either. I thought you should know someone's actually tracking the improvement since you're clearly too busy saving the world to notice it yourself." I'm right here, Harry said, and found, testing the words the way he tested every important claim since a book fell open in a dead man's room, that they were entirely true. I promise, I'm right here. Ron bumped his shoulder, easy and familiar. No weight in it beyond simple, uncomplicated company. Good, he said. Because I believe you when you say you're the master of death and all that. Properly believe it, after everything. But I'd rather have my mate back at the end of the day than a legend, if it's all the same to you. What if I turn out to be both? Harry asked. Half a challenge, half genuine curiosity about how Ron might answer it. Then you'd better learn to switch between them quickly, Ron said, without missing a beat, because I'm not queuing up for an audience every time I want to borrow your Chudley Cannon's scarf. He grinned, easy and unbothered, and something in the simplicity of it eased a knot in Harry's chest. He hadn't fully registered carrying up the tower stairs. Honestly, mate, whatever they end up calling you out there, Wiesengamot, Prophet, all of it. Up here, you're still just Harry. Save the legend stuff for the people who didn't watch you lose spectacularly at Christmas exploding snap. I want that on record, Hermione added, dry, in case you ever get the urge to take yourself too seriously. Which, given the last 4 months, seems like a reasonable precaution to build in early. It's not all the same, Harry said, and meant it more completely than he'd meant almost anything all year. It's the whole point, actually. Everything I did this year, all of it, was so I'd get to still be exactly this, sitting up here with you two, drinking bad tea, arguing about nothing. He looked out over the grounds one last time at the lake and the forest and the whole quiet, saved world spread beneath a sky gone clear and cold and endless, and felt something settle in his chest that had nothing left in it to prove. The rest of it, the authority, the title, the office they've built me, all of that's just the weight I carry so this part stays possible. I'd give every ounce of it back tomorrow before I'd trade this. Somewhere past the edge of what his living eyes could properly perceive, an old and patient presence, listening, as it always now listened, to a soul it had judged worth the answering, allowed itself in whatever fashion, something so vast, allowed itself anything at all, the ghost of something that might, in a lesser being, have been called approval. The sky above the tower had gone fully dark by then, stars scattered clear and cold across the whole wheeling breadth of it, and Harry found himself tracing, without quite meaning to, the old, familiar shapes his father had once shown him, only in photographs and borrowed memory, constellations wheeling slowly overhead the way they had wheeled over every churchyard, every garden, every quiet, grieving room he'd sat in since a book first fell open on his knees in August. He understood, watching them, that the same vast patience governing every star up there governed the authority he now carried too, an old law, older than wands, older than wizards, indifferent to any single life's urgency and yet, somehow, capable of infinite and exact attention to one soul at a time, one asking at a time, one debt honestly settled at a time. He was part of that law now, in whatever small, mortal, borrowed fashion a 16-year-old could be part of anything so vast, and he found, sitting there with his friends and his tea and the whole cold, glittering sky spread out above him, that he was not afraid of the scale of it anymore. He had learned, across one difficult, extraordinary year, exactly how to hold something enormous without letting it hold him instead. The war was over. The 16-year-old who had begun it in a dead man's room with a book of children's stories open on his knees was not entirely that same uncertain person any longer, and would never again be entirely ordinary. But he sat on a cold tower with his oldest friends on either side of him, tea going cold in his hands, master of considerably more than any single story had ever quite prepared him to hold, and found testy that the white, it is code go tight.